I'm now convinced, more than likely, this is a blood-semen mixture.
We didn't know what this DNA was all about. I knew nothing of it. I had heard of it.
This was very new technology. This was one of our very first cases.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Today, DNA analysis is accepted as the forensic tool of the 21st century. But let me take you back to a time before DNA was a science accepted in court. Let me take you back to the year 1990, to a Sunday morning in mid-October. Alice Keating was 6 years old, the only child of divorced parents. Her mother, Grace, was on welfare and struggled to make ends meet. At 7:30 on that Sunday morning, Alice watched cartoons with her mother's new boyfriend. Even though she'd known him less than 2 months, she called him Dad. But things weren't always that smooth between Grace and her boyfriend. At 9 a.m., Alice told her mother she was going out to play. She was allowed to be on her own, but only in and around the building. A neighbor remembered seeing Alice playing at 9:30. When she didn't return for lunch at 11:30, her mother became worried. As time passed, Grace became frantic. At 1 o'clock, when there was no sign of Alice, Grace Keating reported her missing to the police.
You've got to stay as professional as you can, and you've got to shut off your emotional ties to the case. It's harder to do in some cases than others, and these types certainly are the hardest to do. It may sound cold to some people. It probably is cold, but if you don't do that, the case is going to flounder.
She told police that Alice was an obedient child who'd never wandered off on her own. Grace's theory was that some deranged, childless woman had kidnapped the most beautiful little girl in the world, her Alice. Local police mounted what is known as a full-scale Phase 3 search. They put 77 officers into the hunt, a canine unit, a helicopter, and an infrared scope, and hundreds of civilian volunteers. They scoured the neighborhood around Alice's building and looked behind every bush in the valley north of the apartment building. They even checked nearby sewers. The 6-year-old seemed to have vanished into thin air. Grace retreated to her apartment. She wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. Her phone had been turned off months earlier because she couldn't afford to pay her bill. One of the first suspects was Grace herself. A neighbor reported seeing a man and a woman arguing outside the building the night before and driving off with a child in a blue van.
This was the premise that the first police officers were dealing with at the time that they met the mother, and they felt initially that the mother wasn't being truthful with them, and that something had happened in the early morning hours that really resulted in the child being missing.
After an excruciating 24 hours, Grace was cleared when police learned it was a completely different family in the blue van. Meanwhile, the search continued day after day. After 7 days, police informed Grace that they were calling off the search. Grace had never felt so helpless. The police had searched every apartment and all 5 floors, 5 times. But technically, the building had 6 floors. There was a boiler room on the roof. 2 days after the search had been called off, an electrical inspector came upon Alice Keating's body, partially hidden behind one of the boilers.
The room was poorly ventilated, extremely warm, and as happens in these types of conditions, the body had begun to decompose, and at the time of its discovery was in an advanced stage of decomposition.
It was one of the most difficult autopsies the pathologist had ever performed.
Evidence of a sexual component in this case included a massive laceration of the vagina. This was of a very gross nature and would certainly qualify as a brutal sexual assault associated with, in my opinion, the asphyxiation of this child.
With no eyewitness to Alice's abduction and murder, the case would hinge on minute evidence found at the scene of the crime. Using a ladder so as not to contaminate the floor of the boiler room, the forensic ident squad collected hairs and fibers one by one.
It's what we call associative evidence. That is, we try to link people with each other, people with objects, or objects with objects, by the association of trace matters such as hairs and particularly fibers.
Then the ident officers found something else. A small smear on the boiler room floor, something with a liquid content. They didn't know what the smear was, or what it contained. This is when Keith Kelder entered the case. He tested the substance for blood.
In an instant, quick reaction, yes. But I suspected blood being present. Looking at it visually, it's now confirmed.
Then Kelder made a second test. Kelder rubbed the paper with a tiny amount of a chemical solution.
The tests for semen. It's an enzymatic reaction, just as the first test is. And because of the reaction being so intense, I'm now convinced, more than likely, this is a blood-semen mixture.
A sample was also sent to the newly created DNA lab at the Center of Forensic Science. Who had raped and murdered 6-year-old Alice Keating? Exhibit A, a tiny smear of blood and semen held the answer. Homicide investigators interviewed more than 70 people who had access to the boiler room, but in the end, they narrowed the list down to 4 prime suspects. Suspect 1 was Reggie Warner, the building's assistant superintendent. Police learned he'd had an affair with Grace Keating, Alice's mother. That got their attention. So did the fresh cut across the top of Warner's nose. The second suspect, Fred Linus, was an assistant janitor in the building. Number 3 was the youngest suspect, 19-year-old Johnny Tercera, He was a part-time janitor at the building and had been assigned to work the Sunday morning Alice vanished. Then there was a fourth suspect, Grace's boyfriend, Wayne Sorensen. In the 2 months they'd been together, police had been called to intervene in their domestic disputes more than once. All four had alibis as to their whereabouts between 9:30 and 11 that Sunday morning. Reggie Warner claimed he'd gotten the cut on his nose in a barroom fight on the Saturday night. That's why Sunday he'd spent watching TV and doing chores around his house. Fred Linus insisted that Saturday night and Sunday morning he'd been out of town at a motel. Johnny Tercera admitted he'd overdone booze and grass that Saturday night and had been so sick Sunday morning he'd come into work at 8:30 and left less than an hour later. Wayne Sorensen maintained he'd been with Grace Keating the whole time. As investigators checked out their alibis, they wanted something else from the four suspects. Samples of scalp hair, samples of pubic hair, samples of saliva, and samples of blood were taken from each of the suspects. The samples were taken to the Center of Forensic Science, where the forensic team would begin a painstaking process of analysis.
Anytime we're examining either hairs or fibers, it's obviously very easy to say something is different, and therefore we can eliminate it. However, when we find similarities, it may require very extensive testing to determine by a battery of tests whether there are, in fact, still similar at the end of the day.
Crocker was trying to match hairs collected from the suspects with torso hairs collected on the floor of the boiler room. At the time of this case, the early 90s, the ABO system was still the standard for analyzing blood. There were 4 blood types: type A, type B, type O, and type AB. In about 20% of the population, blood types could also be ascertained through bodily secretions, such as saliva and semen. Kelder determined from Alice's medical records that she was type O, and that the blood in the smear on the boiler room floor was type O. This meant that the semen in the mixture came from a man who was type O and a secretor. Despite tremendous odds, Kelder also examined the victim's clothes for semen.
It was extremely important to establish that semen is not only present at the scene on the floor, not far from the body, but also present on the clothing. And so that too had to be vigorously pursued. And even though someone might say, you're not going to find anything on here, it's impossible. How, after this length of time, and yet we pursued it, and yet we got a positive reaction, and yet we found a spermatozoa. And no, it was not sufficient for ABO typing. And we need something far more discriminating, and DNA fit the bill.
Pam Newell would try to compare the DNA from the 4 suspects with the DNA on Alice Keating's clothes and the DNA from the blood-semen mixture in the boiler room.
The interesting thing about the DNA molecule is that 99.9% of all of our DNA is the same. And it's what I call, when I'm talking to a jury, housekeeping DNA. It's the DNA that makes a human being as opposed to an orange peel. So it's DNA that says put a head on the top, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, fingernails, toenails, functioning heart, functioning liver. We're not interested in that sort of DNA when we do forensic DNA analysis because we're all the same. It doesn't help us in answering the question, could this sample have come from this person? What we need to look at is that very small proportion of the DNA molecule where there are differences, where we have the ability to distinguish one person from another.
Of course, given that this would be Canada's first major DNA case, the results would have to be presented in a way that a judge and jury would understand and accept. As for Grace Keating, one day was hard to distinguish from the next. The littlest things could set her off. The bigger things were devastating. Her desire for revenge scared her, and the pain of her murdered daughter seemed too big for one heart to contain.
In a case like this, it gets a lot of public attention. There's a great deal of pressure that comes with these cases. You know that somewhere out there is someone who's done probably the most horrendous crime that could be done, and you've got a duty to find them and bring them before the justice system.
While Alice Keating's murderer still walked free, detectives relied on forensics for their next move. Keith Kelder was ready with his results. Whoever had raped and murdered Alice Keating was a type O and a secretor. Reggie Warner was a type B and a non-secretor. Fred Linus was another type B and a non-secretor. Wayne Sorensen was a type A and a non-secretor. Johnny Tercera was a type O and a secretor. The catch was that approximately 15% of all humans are type O and secretors. Jim Crocker's hair and fiber evidence also pointed to Tercera. From Grace Keating, detectives learned that Tercera had once chased away some boys who were picking on Alice. Because of that, Alice told her mother that Tercera was so cool.
We had surveillance on him. Whenever he would leave from an interview with us, that would tend to be kind of a wild night for him. He'd be out on foot through a lot of the drug areas where he'd be using drugs and alcohol.
Despite all of this, they still didn't have enough to arrest Tercera, but they were zeroing in. Hoping he'd confess, investigators told Tercera they had physical evidence he'd been in the boiler room. That's when he changed his story. He confessed, but only to smoking dope in the boiler room.
Initially, he had denied being up in the room at all or knowing anything about the missing child, and he later changed that and said that on the day, or shortly thereafter, I should say, he had seen the body in the boiler room and that he chose not to tell anyone. He was afraid that he would get into trouble for being up there and finding the body.
Gauthier didn't believe him, but in the hands of a skilled defense lawyer, it could easily be argued that of course traces of Johnny Tercera's hair and blood were found in the boiler room. He was the assistant janitor. They were simply there from some other time. To counter this, Keith Kelder did further tests on the blood-semen mixture.
It could be argued in court that the semen was deposited by the suspect at one point by way of masturbation, and the blood just came later and just happened to be deposited on top of it. And I rejected that hypothesis. The blood and semen were mixed together before they arrived on the floor, before they were applied on the floor. The implications of that are very important.
The sample went straight to Pam Newell's DNA lab. Molecular biologists have developed methods of isolating each DNA molecule and cutting it into different lengths in order for it to be measured and compared. These isolated strands of DNA are then mounted on a plate covered with a gel. When an electrical current is applied, the strands start to move. The gel is then photographed using X-rays, and the result looks like a barcode and is called an autorad.
So think to yourself of all of the swimmers being lined up across the top at the beginning of the race. The race starts, they all start moving down the lanes, and when the race stops, they're stopped in that particular point. We were interested particularly in the profile from the semen on the floor. Now, compared to that, we have DNA samples from suspect number 1, suspect number 2, suspect number 3, and a sample from suspect number 4. When we compare the profile from the semen on the floor to the profiles from each of these 4 suspects, we see that we have a match to suspect number 3 as defined on this particular film.
Pam Newell generated 5 such autorads to compare different parts of the DNA from the semen on the floor. 4 of those tests matched Johnny Tercera's DNA. The odds of such a match is 1 in 1.7 million. despite these overwhelming odds, Detective Gauthier was still reluctant to arrest Tercera.
We held back the arrest for about a 10 or 14-day period because we didn't know what this DNA was all about. I knew nothing of it. I had heard of it. I didn't know what the tests could show or would show. So we held back until such time as we became educated in what DNA was about.
It was the prosecution's case that on that Sunday morning, Alice was looking for a playmate. Tercera came along. At his trial, Tercera's mother swore that Johnny arrived home at 11 a.m., making it impossible for him to have committed the murder. The defense grilled Grace Keating about her finances, her drinking, her sex habits. They exposed every fear and doubt she had about being a good mother, anything to shift the blame away from Johnny Tercera. Then Pam Newell was called to the stand.
This was one of our very first cases, and it was with my heart in my throat that I went into the witness box to give these answers, because we all very much wanted to present the technology in the way in which it should be presented, to give it its fair weight, to present it in an objective and accurate fashion.
She was grilled for 14 days. Ultimately, the jury chose to believe the evidence of her silent witness, a strand of DNA. Johnny Tercera was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. When you lose a child through murder, you fall into a deep black hole of bitterness and depression. If you're lucky enough to have the right support at the right time, you can slowly climb back up into the light. Grace was not so lucky. She had lost the only bright spot in her life. 6 years after the death of her daughter, Grace Keating committed suicide.
This is my first case in homicide. They weren't referred to by a surname and a first name, but by their street names.
And also in this case, there was a vodka bottle.
I've been doing this now, homicides now, for 10 years, and he is one of the wickedest people I have dealt with.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. The Brothers Grimm made up fairy tales that warn children about the evils of the world. This is a contemporary Grimm fairy tale, only it's true. Exhibit A, not what was in the bottle, but the bottle itself. The fire is in a 3-story derelict house in one of the city's most upscale neighborhoods. Because it's been boarded up, the fire is confined to one front room. As firefighters assess the damage, they detect an odor.
If you've ever experienced the smell of a burnt victim, within the confines of a structure. It's something you don't soon forget.
The body is charred beyond recognition. Initially, it's thought the victim is a transient who fell asleep while smoking. To confirm the cause of death and help determine the victim's identity, the body is sent to the morgue to be autopsied by a forensic pathologist.
The back of the body showed two areas where the skin had been spared from the effects of heat. The skin was clearly white. There was a charred gag in the mouth of the individual, and obviously a gag in the mouth would preclude smoking and careless use of cigarette butts. The body appeared to be that of a young female. I stopped what I was doing at that stage and awaited the arrival of the homicide investigators.
This was my first case in homicide. It became quite clear that this was not a fire death at all. In fact, it was a homicide, and a rather brutal homicide.
The cause of death in this case was attributed to ligature strangulation effected by the elastic material in the bra, which was tightly bound twice around the neck. There was evidence of injury to the vagina, that this woman was bound around the ankles, and had the effect of fire not been so great, it would be my opinion that she was equally bound by the wrists.
Because of the sexual assault aspect of it, because of the forcible confinement and the arms being tied, the ligature across the throat, the gag in the mouth, various other aspects of it. It was always a first-degree murder.
Now that it's an official homicide, investigators return to the house. They search the front room where the body was found, looking for clues. Then they head for the second and third floors.
Once at the third floor, it became quite obvious somebody had set up a small room at the front of the house.
Detectives would later discover the place was a squat house for street kids.
There was rats running around. There was human excrement all over because they had been using this place for what they call a squat. And of course that's what squat means. We squat and we do our thing. Some of the rooms were actually knee-deep in discarded items.
Detectives survey the crime scene, but the ident people actually collect the evidence.
Well, we never know in the first instance, you know, what role any particular item can play in the thing. And you can assume that it's going to have considerable importance in some way, but again, at that time, you really don't know.
At this point, the investigation has two major prongs: to find out who committed the murder and to determine the victim's identity.
We started searching our own Toronto files to begin with for missing persons. We had an approximate age. We had a female who, a range of age was 15 to 25, 30. We had no idea. We put out a request through the media, and as a result of that, there was one phone call from an officer in Niagara region who hooked up a missing person down there. We got dental records, and from the dental records, an odontologist matched up the teeth, and that's how we did our identification of her.
The victim was a 16-year-old girl, the youngest daughter of professional parents. She was from a small city near Niagara Falls. Her name was Cynthia Ray. As a last gasp of freedom before starting a summer job at a local burger joint, Cynthia Ray and a young friend had hitchhiked into Toronto to spend a weekend hanging out in the punk scene. That was on a Friday. On the following Tuesday morning, her charred remains had been discovered. What had happened in between? and who had murdered Cynthia Ray. Grady's investigation plunged him into a unique and alien culture, the punk and skinhead universe.
They weren't referred to by a surname and a first name, but by their street names. So we got familiar with those street names. And then when we referred to them as their street names, I think they appreciated it. They were quite cooperative to speak with. You know, we had some of these kids come in and they would have their Doc Marten boots. Like, there were all kinds of different boots they wore. Paratrooper boots, there was army boots, there were police boots. Within this little hierarchy, Doc Martens were the ones that everybody wanted to wear.
Investigators eventually discovered Cynthia Ray had been seen with a guy whose street name was Rodent. Rodent was a punk from a well-to-do family. He'd met Cynthia on Saturday afternoon when she bought a bunch of them some fast food and booze. Cynthia was what was known as a poser, a kid who lived at home during the week and made the scene on the weekends. On the plus side, she had a bank account. When Rodent noticed Cynthia had too much to drink, he felt sorry for her.
There was a woman there who was out taking photographs of interesting people. And there was a group, of which the now deceased, they were amongst the group of people who were being photographed along with some other street kids.
Rodent and Cynthia slept in a park Saturday night. The next day, Sunday, they hung out together and later had sex in a parking lot stairwell. But when Rodent called home and found out that a girl he'd met in Europe was at his parents' house, he decided to go home. The last time he'd seen Cynthia Ray, she was talking to a couple of guys she knew.
Sean Ross, who was known as Football, at this time was 16 years of age. The other, James Harbottle, he was a little older. I think he was 19 or 20 at the time of the offense. He was a punk rocker. He had his hair in a mohawk at one point. He had it shaved right down at one point. He had leather jackets, studs. He was more of a guy who had a rough life and lived on the streets because of his rough life.
It turned out Harbottle had met Cynthia and a friend when they were panhandling the month earlier. He gave them a tab of acid. That night, while her friend slept in a nearby bed, Cynthia had sex with Harbottle. The place where they had spent the night was the same squat house where a month later Cynthia was found murdered. Harbottle's street name was Evil. Meanwhile, the vodka bottle had been sent to the Center of Forensic Science to be analyzed.
One of the issues was whether she'd been sexually assaulted. And so routinely in homicide cases, we get a number of medical samples to check to see whether or not there's semen present. I had those, and also in this case there was a vodka bottle. In this particular case, I noticed some crusty yellow material in the area around the bottle cap. What we want to do is get the material off, and then it's simply a question of swabbing that area. So from looking at the bottle, swabbing off the material, and then testing it, this is what we find. First, that we have spermatozoa present. Secondly, that we have epithelial cells present. And thirdly, that they're vaginal epithelial cells because there's a lot of glycogen present in most of the cells. That combination, plus the typing was consistent with the Crown's theory of what had happened, which was that the vodka bottle had been inserted vaginally.
This confirmed Rodent had slept with Cynthia, but what about Evil or Ross?
All we knew at that time is they were the last ones to be seen with the deceased, and off they had gone. And we had no story from then until when the deceased is found. So we wanted to locate them and find out, was there another perpetrator, whether there's something else? Did they perhaps smoke a joint or whatever and just leave her with somebody else? We had to find them.
Grady received a report that Evil and Ross were stopped on the outskirts of Toronto by a police officer and told to move on. The officer noted that Ross had a pair of 8-hole Doc Marten boots. Cynthia Ray had 8-hole Doc Martens. The next report was that they had hitched out west together. Then Evil and Ross split up. When Grady found out Ross, aka Football, had been transported back to Montreal, he was anxious to talk to him.
I thought he could probably be the best witness in this case. And if you think of it, the one guy's street name is Football. The other's is Evil. And I mean, it may be very basic, but when you're dealing with this, and one was 16 and the other was a little older, one was a bit more of a leader on the street scene, being Evil, a guy who'd been around the streets a bit longer. He'd had a bit of a checkered past, been in and out of trouble with the police, whereas Ross, at this stage, was 16 and didn't seem to have the history that we knew of at that time. And as we're interviewing him, we realize he has a pair of 8-hole Doc Marten boots on. When I showed Ross the picture of the deceased wearing the boots at the Eaton Center with the other people, all friends of his, he took a look at the picture and he just moved back. He goes, "They're hers. Take them." And he took the boots right off there and gave them to us.
Ross claimed Evil had sold him the boots. Then he told detectives about running into Evil and Cynthia on that fateful Sunday night, and how they'd invited him to come back to the squat with them to smoke some hash. The only way into the squat was a third-floor window, and Ross helped Cynthia climb in. They smoked and went to sleep.
And then in the morning, he got up, went off to the Scott Mission, got some new clothes, and then met up with Harbottle, and off they went to Points West. He basically gave us Harbottle with exclusive opportunity.
Meaning he didn't say he saw Evil kill Cynthia, but he certainly implied it. But Grady didn't entirely buy Ross's story. He had a hunch Ross was more involved than he was letting on.
You know, there was nothing to substantiate it, but we were much more concerned after the interview than we were, you know, before, that's for sure.
At this time, blood samples were voluntary. Through his lawyer, Ross declined to give one. But the detectives rushed back in to collect the used cigarette butts for saliva samples.
We actually take the paper itself, and then we would extract, put it into a special liquid. In the case of ABO typing, it's just water, because the ABO substances are soluble in water.
The ABO system could not nail a suspect, but it could exclude one.
Ross was an A secretor, so he was eliminated because there was no group A substance found on the vodka bottle or on the vaginal swabs from the deceased.
Maybe Grady's hunch about Ross was wrong. Maybe he'd been telling the truth, that Evil was the soul-sick murderer. But when they eventually caught up with Evil, he would tell quite a different story. Grady had been getting police updates about Evil's whereabouts, but he still couldn't catch him. Then something he never expected happened. Evil called him.
He was phoning and trying to say that he was a nice guy, He didn't do anything, doesn't know what went on. And we had him arrested while he was in a payphone.
For the first time, Grady was face to face with Evil. Grady had a tape recorder with him. He turned it on and asked Evil if he wanted to say anything. This is the story Evil told him on the ride back. Yes, Ross had run into him and Cynthia that Sunday night. And yes, they'd helped Cynthia climb into the squat. And yes, they'd smoked some hash and gone to sleep. But this is where Evil's story differed from Ross's. In Evil's account, both he and Ross had gone off in the morning to the Scott Mission to get clean clothes, leaving Cynthia still sleeping. But according to Evil, he and Ross both went back to the squat. Ross wanted sex, and when Cynthia wasn't interested, Ross said, "Let's rape her." Evil thought it was a prank, but it suddenly got serious when Ross started cutting off Cynthia's clothes and tied her up. Then Ross sexually assaulted Cynthia with the vodka bottle. Cynthia cried she was going to the police, so Ross took Evil to the next room and said, "Well then, we're going to have to kill her." And Evil said, "Go for it, but do it kindly." But there was nothing kind about it. Evil and Ross tried cutting her wrists. When that didn't work, they carried her downstairs and strangled her with her bra. Then they went out to huff some glue. That's when they decided to return to the squat and hide Cynthia's body under an overturned couch and set the whole thing on fire. It was brutal and sadistic. Ross, meanwhile, was on the lam. It took police 2 months to find him.
He's arrested in Montreal for doing a robbery of a kid, and the robbery was for a pair of 8-hole Doc Marten boots.
Evil was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to life. But Ross denied any part in Cynthia Ray's murder.
He has never admitted to it, has never admitted his part, has denied everything, denied sexually assaulting the deceased in this matter, has denied anything to do with the vodka bottle or anything like that.
Evil was willing to testify against Ross, but what judge or jury would believe him? It would all come down to the vodka bottle. Exhibit A. We're all used to hearing about the phenomenal results of DNA, but only with fingerprints do you get an absolute match.
What we're looking at is just the ridge structures, any place where they divide or where they end, where there are small dots. These are all individual characteristics or characteristics that are unique to that one impression. There is no reported or known case of two persons' fingerprints being the same. Okay, this is the actual bottle from the crime scene. They have applied the photograph here to show the actual location of the print. This impression is the left ring finger of Sean Ross. This is on the item in a position consistent with the scenario of Ross using this to sexually assault the victim. I think that's what they call the clincher.
Thanks to this forensic evidence, Sean Ross, aka Football, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. Because he was a young offender at the time of the incident, he would be eligible for parole in 10 years.
Ross had no conscience, had no remorse. Harbottle, as diminished as the remorse was, at least there was some. As his remorse, to me at least, was for his lack of action dealing with Ross. I think Ross did it because he liked the power, the control, and as he's told other witnesses, he liked watching the eyes bug out. That gave him a lot of power and control. I've been doing this now, the homicides now, for 10 years, and he is one of the wickedest people I have dealt with.
Most of the time we don't get involved with the people. we get involved with samples. But there are still cases, doesn't matter, they get to you no matter how you try and keep them from doing so. And usually those are really nasty cases. They're the kind that can give you nightmares.
How many of us can think of the close calls of our youth when we unknowingly put ourselves in awful danger and how lucky we were to escape? Cynthia Ray had her whole life ahead of her. Like so many teenagers before her, she was just trying to fit into a scene. The tragedy is that on that fateful Sunday night, Cynthia Ray got too close to the flame when she entered the house where evil lives.
It's like he's playing a game with you. He's trying to find out what you have by the questions you ask. If he's her guardian, and I believe he was, he's not doing a whole lot to help her this time. So that's why I believe that that was the last day.
Is it a bite? Is it a human bite? Also, it was an aggressive type bite mark because it was a single penetration.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. One of his dozens of love letters went like this: "Never stop believing in yourself as I believe in you. No matter what happens, Natalia, I will always be there for you. My love for you is unconditional." Where does love end and obsession begin? Exhibit A, a bite mark on a body. Natalia Mazursky was 21 when she arrived from Russia on Valentine's Day, 1992. Her family was heartbroken to see her go, but knew that life would be better for their daughter in Canada, the promised land. She came to marry Ivan Kravchuk, a Russian boy who had immigrated before her. But the marriage broke up after a few short months and Ivan moved out west, later filing for divorce. Natalia, now all alone in a new country, decided to enroll at university in interior design. At home, she'd been a talented painter. In her first 2 years in Canada, she had several exhibitions of her work. By this time, she had met Alex Plotkin, another Russian who had grown up in Canada. They eventually started living together. Natalia felt they were meant for each other. But it was a stormy relationship, and she asked Alex to move out. Around that time, Gilbert Ho, a friend of a friend, helped her get a job at a trendy downtown restaurant. That's where she met Glenn Rollins. Glenn had money and was a regular at the restaurant. Less than a month after he had known her, they became engaged. But after a drunken confrontation one night, it all ended. But Natalia wasn't the kind of woman you could easily forget. They all stayed in touch with her. It was on a Monday morning in January when Natalia's phone started to ring. It rang on and off all day and night, but no one answered it. No one.
Hey, Princess, it's me. Good morning. I took care of all that divorce stuff with Ivan for you, so not to worry.
Hey, Natalia, I'm just picking up a pizza and bringing it over.
Hey, it's me. Just getting off work. I was gonna come over.
Where are you? It's Ivan. I've been calling you. Give me a call.
It continued to ring over the next 2 days and nights.
Hey, where were you? Natalia. This is Ivan.
Hey, Nat, it's Annie. Didn't see you at school today. People have been looking for you.
Hope you got the rent money together. Otherwise, you're going to get evicted. Bye, Princess. Talk to you later.
Just give me a call so I know you're okay.
By Thursday, her friend Gilbert Ho, the bartender from the restaurant, was worried enough to get the superintendent to check on her apartment. Something horrible had happened. Natalia is dead. Gilbert calls police. Homicide is brought in.
It was a very cold day. The door was open to the balcony, and I thought perhaps it was for the dog. You don't leave your balcony door open in January. The first thing that I remember when I walked in the apartment was a small bathroom to my left, and I could see a body in the bathtub. The bedroom door was opened. That tells you where it happened.
The body is a crime scene unto itself. It tells its own story.
The striking injuries in this case were those to the head area, and the face, for example, showed multiple lacerations. Lacerations are tears of the skin. The red marks here are indicating the sites of lacerations. This is tearing of the skin from, as you can see here, the forehead, as well as both the right and left sides of the scalp. So one can say that we're dealing with a blunt object, and we're dealing with a very large number, greater than 20 blows or impacts to the head.
An injury like this suggests the possibility of a hammer or hammer-like object, which is what they found when the tub was drained. The number of blows to the head and face indicates a great deal of anger towards the victim. Then the pathologist noticed something that was going to prove invaluable for investigators.
There was an abrasion, which is a scraping of the skin around the left nipple. And it was the configuration, the shape of this abrasion, which was semicircular, which suggested to myself that this may well have been a bite mark.
The use of teeth and bite marks for forensic identification purposes goes back over 100 years.
The first question, or the first fork in the road, is it a bite? And then the second fork in the road is it a human bite? And then the third fork in the road is, which human? Well, in this case, it was, there were two markings, one above the nipple and one below the nipple on the deceased, and the markings were consistent with a human bite. And furthermore, they were consistent with a bite mark, in my opinion, that was of a sexual nature, being as it was on the breast, and also it was an aggressive type bite mark because it was a single penetration, fleeting sexual bite where there was grasping, enough pressure to break the skin, yet there was no central bruising that one would see, say, for example, with a hickey or an affectionate bite mark.
Dr. Wood also determines that the bite mark was made at the same time as the head wounds. It suggests that whoever bit Natalia Mazursky had also murdered her. The blows to the head, the vicious bite mark, the drowning. Someone's hatred had exploded at this beautiful young woman. Would Exhibit A, this human bite mark, be enough to catch a brutal killer? In the week following Natalia's murder, Detective Mike Hamill returns repeatedly to her apartment. He needs to take it all in at his own pace, piece by piece, clue by clue.
You have to spend a lot of time there. You have to look around. You have to sit there and look and try to put pieces together in your own mind. I'm trying to figure out what happened. There's no signs of forcible entry, so obviously she invited them in. There was no blood from the bed on the floor to the bathroom. And normally when the body's moved right after the murder or after being assaulted, there's blood involved, you'll see drag marks, and it happens very quickly.
In order to interpret the scene, investigators call in blood expert Susan Kern. The blood spatter adds to the chilling story of the murder.
They called me here to assist them to understand if the beating actually occurred in the bedroom and that she was later transported to the bathroom, and how to best photograph these stains to preserve the information at the scene. It all appears to originate from somewhere on the bed, traveling, as you can see by the arrows, outwards from this location. If a hammer, in this case, has been used to deliver repeated blows to a surface that is continuing to produce liquid blood from it, such as a head, during the swinging of the weapon, the liquid blood will come away from the surface of the hammer itself, and those droplets will impact on whatever surface is around, such as the ceiling. And in my mind, the only way to get from one room to the other room without leaving a lot of blood is that she had been wrapped up in say, a blanket or a sleeping bag or something of that nature to prevent the blood from dripping onto the floor.
One of the biggest puzzles in the bedroom was a ring of blood on the dresser. She had one dresser in her bedroom, and it's like someone had taken a cup, placed it on the bed, on the blood while it was still fresh, and then placed the cup on the dresser. And then in the bathroom we found a cup which appeared to be the same size as of the ring on the dresser.
Hamill felt the fact that the killer moved around from room to room with this cup meant that he was at ease in Natalia's apartment.
I was satisfied that the person who killed her was very close to her.
From Natalia's birth control pills and an interview with Natalia's neighbor who remembered hearing a loud bang on his adjacent bedroom wall, the time of death is established as late Sunday or early Monday morning. Hamill began to investigate his suspects, keeping in mind that one of them had viciously bitten Natalia. The first person Detective Hamill brought into interview on videotape was Gilbert Ho, because he was the first person to discover the body.
He came across as someone that she needed because she was going through some difficult times in her life. And he came across as her crying shoulder whenever she needed someone. He was the guy. He left several messages on her answering machine. Those messages were left after she was dead.
Gilbert had helped her with a school project that Sunday night, the last time he saw her alive. He said that her ex-husband Ivan phoned from out west that night to discuss their divorce. Gilbert offered to help her with the details. Ivan's voice was also identified on her answering machine several days after they believed she was murdered. Gilbert, who claimed to also be Natalia's sometime lover, said Natalia later got a call from some guy she said she was going out to meet. That's why Gilbert left her at 11:30 on Sunday night. Had the mysterious caller been her murderer? The cops asked Gilbert if he knew anything else about the other men in Natalia's life. Gilbert told them about her boyfriend, Alex. A shirt of his was found on her bedroom floor soaked in blood. Alex's voice was also identified on her answering machine. Gilbert told detectives that he had more than once had to console Natalia in the restaurant after a row with Alex. Alex admitted having sex with her on the Friday and Saturday before her murder.
When I first met her boyfriend, he was very, very emotionally upset. A nice, easygoing guy, very pleasant. I can see why she would like him.
The final suspect was a doozy, Glenn Rollins, her ex-fiancé from the restaurant. Glenn was very possessive of Natalia, and one night shortly after they were engaged, he barged into her apartment building drunk. He claimed Natalia was playing him for a sucker and demanded his engagement ring back. When she wouldn't open the door, he became enraged. This was just 1 month before Natalia's murder.
And of course, he became a suspect because of that. I mean, you just don't come over and break down the door with a sledgehammer.
Glenn was charged with assault. When she was later found murdered, the media was all over him. Their theory was that he was a spurned lover with a streak of violence. These were the 4 suspects. Mike Hamill would need to make bite mark impressions from all of them. While Hamill was still investigating, Natalia's family came over from Russia to attend her funeral.
You could tell it when you met the family. I mean, our cultures are way off. They're very different. And you could sense the feeling from these people. They just couldn't understand, how could this happen?
In addition to Natalia's family, 3 of the suspects were also there: Ivan, Alex, and Gilbert. Mike Hamill was there too, as a mourner and an investigator.
In these types of cases, any other homicide cases, you're going to end up with a number of suspects. The faster you eliminate them, the more time you'll have to spend on your real suspect.
Ivan Kravchuk, Natalia's ex-husband, still lived out west, and it didn't appear that he could have flown in and committed the murder.
He had a perfect alibi, so he was out of the picture as a suspect.
As for Alex Plotkin, on the night of the murder, his roommate swore he'd been sleeping on the couch and was still there when she returned from work late that night.
But he had his own place, and we had an alibi for him as well.
Then there was Gilbert Ho. He came over to Detective Hamill and thanked him for coming. This was tough for Hamill because he had begun to suspect Gilbert.
Of course, we suspected that he was the murderer, and sometimes it's difficult to be there and play a role, you know, play the dummy. Yeah, of course you have to.
Hamill had suspicions from his very first interview with Mr. Ho.
He was drained out of his emotions, and there should have been something more. He was claiming to be a very good friend, and very good friends don't react the way he did.
Investigators also learned that even though Gilbert had a wife and 2 young children, he had paid for all of Natalia's furniture and her rent. People from the restaurant where they worked said that Gilbert was in love with Natalia.
When we spoke to Gilbert Ho, we asked him if he loved her, and yes, he loved her. We asked him if he had sex with her. He said he did. I don't believe he did, ever. I asked him, well, did you bite her? And the next question, if he's willing to say, well, I didn't bite her, but I may have sucked on her, I sucked on her breast. Okay, well, the next question is, would you have hurt her? No, I would never hurt her.
Gilbert was willing to give Detective Hamill his bite mark impression right away. So was Alex. But what about Glenn Rollins, Natalia's ex-fiancé who had assaulted her? He had an alibi for the night of the murder too. That he'd gone to see Get Shorty with a friend. Glenn Rollins agreed to give Hamill his bite mark impression in exchange for dropping the assault charges. It would all come down to the bite mark impressions.
Here you have the 3 suspects' models. The question has to be looked at from two ways. Is it this person? And that's important to the police. And can I exclude this person? And if I can exclude the person, certainly that's very important to the police, for the police to know as well. This is the tape that was shown to the jury that was made from the computer. And what we have here, we have suspect 3's teeth, which we are superimposing on the bite mark over the breast. These teeth are obviously not a match. They're far too wide. They're at an odd angulation for this to be a possible match, both in the upper and in the lower arch. So we're moving on now to the second suspect. But again, they're too large. The arch is too large, and where there are teeth that should be leaving marks, there are no marks. And now we have Mr. Ho's dentition and the corrected teeth here, and they fit quite nicely. He's got a smaller arch, and the teeth can be seen to be in the proper position for making the blackened bruises that appear both above and below the nipple. The outlines of the teeth fit very nicely with the bruises. You'll see them disappear and the bruises appear right beneath where the markings are. So I concluded that this was a match. I believe, and I'm not certain, that Mr. Ho denied making a bite mark on the breast, and now we have somehow miraculously his dentition's print on this woman's breast.
This is the story that Detective Hamill and his team were able to piece together. It turned out that Gilbert was broke. The checks he had written for Natalia's rent had bounced, and she was going to be evicted the very next day, and she didn't even know it. So when Gilbert went over to Natalia's that Sunday night, he knew this might be his last night with his princess, and that the relationship was about to change.
Here's this poor girl. She's about to be evicted. She has no clue this is about to happen. And her guardian, if he's her guardian, and I believe he was, he's not doing a whole lot to help her this time. So that's why I believe that that was her last day.
Hamill believed Gilbert wanted sex. After everything he had done for Natalia, it was the least she could do for him. When she refused, he exploded in outrage. He bludgeoned her, then he bit her, then he thought about what to do next. He wrapped her head in a towel and carried her to the tub to try to cover it up.
It's the only mistake he made, was he bit her. Because without that, we could not put Mr. Ho at the scene at the time of her death.
Gilbert Ho was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
He was obsessed with her. If he could not have her, no one else could.
No matter what happens, I will always be there for you. My love for you is unconditional. Maybe Natalia, anxious to fit into her newly adopted country, ignored the signs of Gilbert Ho's obsession. Maybe she didn't have the heart to tell him to leave her alone. The tragedy is no one else did either. Natalia Mazurski was buried almost 3 years to the day she arrived in this country on Valentine's Day. She will always remain a beautiful Russian princess.
It's not common where you see someone about to be killed. Two of the accused were blaming each other. Both wanted to be one of the robbers as opposed to the one who was the actual shooter.
Our task was to identify which one of these suspects was potentially the killer.
It's the first time I've heard a judge tell the jury after their verdict that they were naive and gullible.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Imagine you're an associate professor in the athletic department at a university, and one day you get a phone call from the police asking you to help solve a violent crime. Well, that's exactly what happened to Susan Tupling. Tupling's specialty is sports biomechanics, looking at human movement in a sports context so that athletes from beginners to pros can have more success sooner and fewer potential injuries. At the end of the 19th century, thanks to the development of a faster shutter speed, Edward Muybridge did a famous series of photographs. This was the birth of movies and the birth of biomechanics, because for the first time, human movement could be studied frame by frame. But none of this prepared Susan Tupling when out of the blue, the police called.
There had been a homicide, and they wanted to find out about the heights of these potential suspects and they had a video of it.
A homicide? A video? Wait a minute. Our story begins around 4:30 on a dark winter morning. The police have answered an emergency call at a variety store. The store clerk had been shot dead.
We went into the store initially to have a quick look at the body, to get a feel for what this situation was about. And we learned that there was a video camera within the store, mounted up above the cash register area. We're hopeful that the tape is running and that the tape is good enough quality to capture what's happened.
But there is a problem. The surveillance tape is on a 6-hour loop before it records over itself, and the VCR is locked in a backroom office.
So I had one of the officers smash the glass in that window to get access to it and retrieve the tape.
Exhibit A, a surveillance tape. The tape is sent to a police lab with special video equipment. Outside, Fatima Perez arrives to pick up her son as planned. Detectives try to break his death to her gently. Just as the tragedy is sinking in, a TV camera crew is upon her. Angel Perez, her son, was 27. Being a dutiful son, he still lived at home, helping to support his mother and siblings. When he was laid off as a plumber's assistant, rather than go on welfare, Angel took a minimum wage job working in a nearby variety store. The night in question, he'd been working the midnight shift. Between midnight and 3, he worked with the store owner. After 3, Angel was on his own. Now he was dead. As with all homicides, Angel Perez's body is sent to the morgue to be autopsied. The pathologist will determine exactly how the store clerk died.
The cause of death is attributable to a shotgun wound. The pellets were found mainly on the frontal portion of the skull and facial bones. A snowstorm of lead fragments is associated with the pellets within the head. And if we look at this next X-ray, there are a large number of pellets embedded in the left hand and wrist. The effect of powder and unburnt powder against the bone of the skull, and would indicate that the gun was discharged from a close range. That the individual's injuries are quite compatible with him lying on the ground with his left hand and wrist close to the side of his head, face down, in a non-offensive position.
The conclusion? Angel wasn't defending himself. It was an execution-style murder. At the murder scene, forensic identification officers are particularly interested in a footprint on the store's Formica countertop. Normally, when we think of clues, we think of fingerprints. But in reality, footprints help solve more crimes. Taking footprint impressions is usually a straightforward procedure. Not this time. Somehow, in trying to transfer the footprint to tape, it vanishes. It's not on the tape and has disappeared from the Formica counter. This phenomenon is rare but not unheard of among footprint examiners. Meanwhile, police have viewed the surveillance video. The good news is that it shows the crime. The bad news is how grainy it is.
The quality of video that we receive from stores, banks, whatever, is very bad quality because these tapes are played over and over and over again, and sometimes they're not the best quality videotapes. I'm able to improve the brightness, the contrast. I can filter. We can help to alleviate the background noise. What we're trying to do is sharpen the image, which can identify either jackets, footwear, or the faces.
Even using digital enhancement, the videotape can only be cleaned up marginally.
We knew that we were not going to be able to facially identify anyone from the video. And we also felt that we could not tell the skin color of the individuals, nor the sex of the individuals.
If Gauthier tells the press how little he knows about the perpetrators, it'll give the felons a psychological boost. But given the violent nature of the crime, the media is all over the police, clamoring for details. In the end, he decides to broadcast the video as a special bulletin. This will give him a chance to enlist the public's help without subjecting himself to a media scrum. The videotape you are about to see is the real thing. The actual videotape of the murder, as narrated by Detective Gauthier. To protect the innocent, the name of the store and the name of the victim have been bleeped out.
The videotape you are about to see will show the store clerk walk towards the front of the store and then out of the camera view. Seconds later, you will see suspect number 1 enter the store carrying a long barrel firearm. The suspect immediately walks toward Mr. At this time, suspect number 1 shoots Mr. in the head, killing the store clerk. Suspects number 2 and number 3 enter the store carrying empty garbage cans. You will see that they now are joined by suspect number 1 near the store counter. Suspects number 2 and number 3 then jump over the counter and ransack the cabinets, stealing a quantity of cigarettes. Three suspects then leave the store via the same front door. Suspect number 1, dark color clothing, a waist-length coat, a hat and bandana are worn over the face. This person is wearing dark gloves. Suspect number 2 is wearing a black color hip-length hooded coat. The Detroit Red Wings logo is on the center of the back. Suspect number 3 is wearing a black waist-length hooded coat, and below that, in the center of the jacket, is the Bulls logo. The Metropolitan Toronto Police request the help of the public in solving this brutal execution-style murder.
A picture is worth 1,000 words, but in this case, a videotape, Exhibit A, raised 1,000 questions. Though the videotape of the robbery murder couldn't immediately identify any of the suspects, Detective Gauthier knew it was crucial to the investigation.
It's not common that you see something like this where you see someone about to be killed and you're watching the tape knowing that someone's about to be killed and you see them in real life and you know that in 5 seconds they're gone.
The videotape showed a car's headlights in the store's front window. Someone else had pulled into the plaza that night. From viewing the rest of the tape, detectives determined no one else had entered the store.
Who would be at the plaza at that time of night? There was nothing open in the plaza except the store. The only other thing that is accessible is the ATM machine in a bank. We contacted the bank to find out whether or not anybody had used that machine throughout the early morning hours. When we did find, in fact, an individual at about that time, when we spoke to him, he then related a story to us about what he had seen when he arrived at the plaza.
This is what the witness told investigators he saw. During his special bulletin, Detective Gauthier had also broadcast information about the red car. A police officer called homicide after seeing the TV broadcast to report he'd had the abandoned car towed to a pound. The car, it turned out, belonged to a woman named Andrea Goodwin. This seemed to fit nicely with a Crime Stoppers tip investigators received that the perpetrators in the murder robbery were two men and a woman. But under questioning, Andrea Goodwin claimed she knew nothing about any robbery. She said when she'd picked up her car, she'd found garbage cans, a gun, and cartons of cigarettes. Not knowing where they'd come from, they dumped the cigarettes and the garbage cans by the side of the road and tossed the gun into a dumpster. Investigators recovered the cigarettes and the garbage cans, but the gun was never recovered.
Well, the shotgun had gone to the Pickering land site. Those are vast, vast properties. It's an impossible task to try and find something that size as a sawed-off shotgun in a vast expanse like that.
If Andrea Goodwin was telling the truth, how had her car ended up as a getaway car? Andrea Goodwin said she'd lent it for the night to her boyfriend, Wallace Avery. This was his story. He had rented the car to a guy named Hugh Goff in exchange for crack cocaine. Then he had gone off to do the rock. He swore he was telling the truth. What gave Detective Gauthier pause was learning that Avery had just been released from prison for armed robbery.
He seemed, certainly by his background, he would be somebody that would be apt to do this. We spent days analyzing the story of this woman's boyfriend, comparing it to what we knew from the scene and other information that had come in.
As investigators checked out Avery's story, they also searched for Hugh Goff, the man who had allegedly rented the red car that night. They couldn't find Goff, but they tracked down his girlfriend. Under questioning, she reluctantly admitted that hours after the murder, she'd driven Goff to New York City so he could make his escape. As American colleagues tried to locate Goff in New York City, detectives in Toronto received a number of Crime Stoppers tips about a guy named Sherwin Alexander. Alexander was brought in for questioning. Alexander admitted he was involved in the robbery, but he swore he was not the murderer. According to Alexander, he was the one wearing the Chicago Bulls jacket. His 17-year-old friend was wearing the Red Wings jacket, and Hugh Goff, in the black jacket, was the shooter. Case solved? Nah. According to Goff's girlfriend, on the drive to New York City, Goff had told her a totally different story. Goff admitted he was involved in the robbery, but swore that Sherwin Alexander was the one who shot the store clerk. In Goff's account, he also had the 17-year-old in the Red Wings jacket. But Goff claimed he was the one wearing the Bulls jacket, and Alexander was the shooter in the black jacket.
Two of the accused were blaming each other. They were admitting they were involved in the event, but both wanted to be one of the robbers as opposed to the one who was the actual shooter.
Who was telling the truth? The height difference between the two was about 8 inches. Could investigators use that difference to single out the shooter? Remember the footprint that disappeared?
The investigators from Metro, they brought me the full counter. So I got an electric saw and I cut it down to this size, so that it was a workable size. So the first thing that I do, I'm going to capture the footwear on the arborite top with the camera. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to completely wipe off with alcohol the footwear impression. With the camera, I'm going to capture the exact same area. And then I'm going to digitize it so that I can analyze it with the computer. Having now captured both images, Number 1 being the arborite top with the footwear impression, and number 2 being just the arborite top on its own. I'm going to subtract one image from the other, and I'm left with the footwear impression.
The prints seemed to come from a size 12 Converse sneaker. Detectives wondered if knowing that could help determine whether Goff or Alexander was in the bull's jacket. By a process of elimination, the other one would be the shooter in the black jacket. That's when they got hold of Susan Tupling.
But the idea was, could I from that know how tall this potential subject was? And of course I couldn't, because people of all different heights have size 12 shoes if it was a size 12 shoe. So I couldn't do it from there.
Tupling used biomechanics to study human movement in the lab, but would it work to catch Angel Perez's killer? Who had been the shooter, Goff or Alexander? Detective Gauthier was relying on biomechanics to pinpoint the killer.
Our main focus was to find the one with the gun. So the biomechanical was everything to us to establish that we had the right individual as being the trigger man.
From the early days of Edward Muybridge's photos through contemporary biomechanics studies, the subjects were often in no clothes or tight-fitting clothes. That was perfect for Tupling's academic studies, but in the robbery-murder, the suspects were in hoods and hats and bulky clothes. Then there was the camera angle. Lab studies were done at eye level. The angle from the store's surveillance camera from above foreshortened heights. Another problem, which image of the suspects should they try to measure?
They were always running, crouching down, reaching over to grab things off of shelves. And so they never stood perfectly still for us. And that's how you measure someone's height. They have to stand perfectly upright for you. And these suspects, as in most human movements, you just don't conform to that sort of situation.
By examining the video frame by frame, Tupling found 2 locations where they could see a suspect's head and feet, and the suspect stood straight up.
The idea is to find when he's standing vertical. He has to be on one leg or 2 legs standing straight up. And just before he jumps over, he is standing as vertical as he's going to be. That's about it right there. But if we could calibrate the volume that they were in, set up some sort of an X, Y, Z axis, a big grid within the whole store, then we could sort of use our 3-dimensional techniques that we use within the lab all the time to make an estimate of how tall the different suspects were.
Tupling's colleague had developed a technique using a calibrated frame and moving it around the store. When the numbers from the various X, Y, Z coordinates were crunched into the computer, it essentially turned the 2D image into a 3D determination of volume. From the volume, they hoped they could figure out the heights of the 3 suspects. Then the results were analyzed and double-checked to ensure accuracy.
We concluded they were 3 unique heights with quite large differences between them. So between the shortest and the middle suspects, there was 4 inches difference. And between the middle and the tallest, we had 6 inches difference. In the video, the suspect with the black coat was the one who carried the gun into the store and performed the shooting. And our data indicated that he was the shortest of the 3 suspects.
So Alexander, the shortest guy, was the shooter in the black jacket. Based on all this, this is what investigators think happened on the night in question. After trading crack for the red car, Goff picked up Alexander and the 17-year-old and drove to the variety store. There they waited outside watching. The last customer left around 3:15. Alexander, the gunman, entered first. Then Goff and the 17-year-old entered, Goff wearing the bull's jacket. Goff and the 17-year-old were convicted of armed robbery. Sherwin Alexander was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution contended that the killing of Angel Perez was an execution-style murder. The defense argued that Alexander's gun had gone off accidentally. Because the gun had never been recovered, the jury refused to rule out the possibility the gun had discharged accidentally. In the end, Sherwin Alexander's charge was reduced and he was sentenced to manslaughter. Angel's mother and siblings were furious with what they considered the leniency of the sentences.
I can't explain why the jury came back with a manslaughter on to us what was clearly an execution case. It's the first time I've heard a judge tell the jury after the verdict that they were naive and gullible, were his words.
I don't think I thought of the human factor initially. We were so wrapped up with making sure everything was so accurate and so precise. And then it sort of hits you that this is the human factor. This is what it was all about.
The art of moving pictures and the science of biomechanics had been born together at the turn of the century. 100 years later, they came together again to decipher a video and help investigators convict a murderer. Take a rich tycoon. He's one and only child. The tycoon's second wife. Add a $2 million will. Mutual suspicion. And a rookie document examiner. It takes the same kind of examination skills to determine if a document is genuine as it does to pronounce it a forgery. Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Think of famous signatures, Napoleon, Shakespeare, and Michael Jordan. Each worth a fortune. Yet this signature, unknown except to his immediate family, would be worth $2 million. Exhibit A. The last will and testament of Mr. Dennis Lloyd. Dennis Lloyd was a self-made man. Devoting himself to making money, by the time he was 60, he owned extensive real estate and a lucrative paper factory. In the town of Markham, Ontario, he was a rich fish in a medium-sized pond. But as a person, Dennis Lloyd was cold and distant. He rarely visited with his grown-up son, Barry, and Barry's family. And he could be curt and insensitive to his second wife, Carolyn. The first time Dennis brought Carolyn to spend Christmas with Barry's family, he only succeeded in creating a rivalry between them. After that, Dennis's affection seemed to swing between Carolyn and Barry. 1 month favoring one, the next month the other. This was the situation when Dennis suffered a serious heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital. When his condition improved, he refused to think about death or talk about his will. Then 3 weeks later, he suddenly died of cardiac arrest. In their moment of grief, there was a temporary softening of their long-standing enmity. But a few weeks later, Carolyn and Barry were summoned by the estate's executor to a reading of Dennis's will. Dennis Lloyd's will left $20,000 annually to Carolyn. But the bulk of his $2 million estate went to Barry, his wife, and son. Carolyn was shocked. Barry, of course, was delighted, as much by the clear acknowledgement of his dad's love as by the money. Zachary Bloom, Carolyn's lawyer, examined the will. He was suspicious because the will was 7 years old, but a search for a more recent will proved fruitless. Dennis Lloyd died in March. Despite Carolyn's dismay at the will, her sorrow was so profound that it took 4 months before she could enter Dennis's private bedroom. Finally, she asked her longtime gardener to help her pack her husband's effects. When the gardener went to clear out a dresser, Carolyn told him Dennis never kept anything valuable in it. But she was wrong. Hidden in a Bible was a new will. A will that would be the centerpiece of a huge legal battle. A winner-take-all battle between stepmother and son. Based on this, the parties reconvened at the executor's office. Carolyn came accompanied by her lawyer, Zachary Bloom, as well as by the 2 witnesses to the new will, Dennis's friend and real estate agent Stanley Pavel, and Cassandra Edmonds, a family friend who at one time had been Dennis's executive secretary. To protect his interests, Barry brought along his attorney. The new will, dated the previous Thanksgiving, left $500,000 to Barry and his family. The rest of Dennis Lloyd's real estate holdings and paper factory went to Carolyn. This time it was Carolyn's turn to be delighted. Barry was incensed. More than that, he was suspicious. The previous Christmas, his father had made him certain promises about his estate. Barry was adamant that his father would never have hidden this new will from him. When people have suspicions about documents, there's a place to check them out. At the Center of Forensic Sciences, there's a whole section that examines documents. Using a variety of machines and techniques, document experts can investigate and analyze everything from ransom notes to checks made with invisible ink to questions of cheating on university exams. The student hadn't cheated, the professor was wrong. One of the main areas is document examination. Everything from watermarks and typeface to handwriting and signatures. Greg Dawson is the head of the document section, but at the time he was just a rookie.
It was assigned to me because they thought it was fairly straightforward. It was a simple one-page document, a little bit of typewriting on it, and one signature. What could be so more simple than that? Just one word, D. Lloyd, was written. Combination of 6 letters.
6 letters worth $2 million. So the resource was there for Barry to authenticate the will. One major problem. A clause at the bottom of the will that said, if any beneficiary should contest any of the bequests herein to him or her, then such person or persons is not to receive the said bequest. In other words, if Barry contested the will and lost, he would lose everything. Was it worth the gamble? Did Barry really have grounds for suspicion? Or was it just sour grapes, jealousy that in his final act his father had chosen Carolyn over him? After weighing it over, Barry decided to risk it all. Barry went to court against his stepmother. $2 million, winner take all. The issue, whether Dennis Lloyd's new will was genuine or a forgery. If it was a forgery, Barry would get it all. If it was genuine, Carolyn would keep it all. It was to be a civil trial decided by a judge. Given that a deceased cannot testify, an exception is made in cases concerning wills allowing both sides to give hearsay evidence. Barry Lloyd took the stand. The heart of his case was a promise his father had made him the previous Christmas. While Carolyn was off in Italy, his father spent the holidays with Barry's family. Dennis told Barry about having spent his whole life worrying about money. Now he was concerned what would happen to it when he died. Dennis confided to his son that he planned to leave Carolyn $20,000 annually, but he wanted his paper factory and the rest of his $2 million estate to go to his flesh and blood. Barry truly believed that his father would never have changed his mind without saying something. Plus, there were a lot of strange circumstances surrounding this latest will. For instance, why would his father, who had never been religious, hide his will inside a Bible? And why, if this new will was dated the previous Thanksgiving, did it only come to light 4 months after his father's death? Dennis's friend, Stanley Pavel, provided the answer. The previous Thanksgiving, Stanley and his wife, Dennis and Carolyn, and Cassandra Edmonds had all gone on a fun weekend junket to Las Vegas. Though Dennis didn't gamble, he loved to watch Stanley gamble. On that Saturday night, Dennis suddenly whispered he wanted Stanley to come up to his hotel suite right away. As they entered the room, they saw Carolyn and Cassandra, who had just come back from shopping. On the pretense they had to catch an early dinner and show, Dennis urged Carolyn to get ready as quickly as possible. Then he took a piece of paper out of his briefcase. It was his will, and he wanted them to witness it. Dennis made them both promise not to mention anything to Carolyn. He wanted the new will to be a surprise. That was why Carolyn hadn't known about the new will until after Dennis Lloyd's death, when it fell out of the Bible. Cassandra Edmonds confirmed Stanley Pavel's story. She testified that as Dennis's secretary, she had heard him criticize Barry for thinking money grew on trees, adding that Barry would be in for a big surprise if he thought he was going to inherit the old man's money. It all made sense, more than Barry Lloyd wanted to admit. But Barry wasn't about to give up. He was suspicious about certain spelling mistakes in the will. For instance, the city of Markham, M-A-R-K-H-A-M, the only city Dennis Lloyd had lived in since coming over from England, was misspelled. More inexplicable, his father's last name, Lloyd, L-L-O-Y-D, was misspelled in the very first line. Dennis was a meticulous man, so why would he have left these mistakes in? Zachary Bloom testified that he and his wife had also gone to Las Vegas Thanksgiving weekend. and that he had accidentally run into Dennis Lloyd. Dennis didn't trust most lawyers, but he trusted Bloom. He insisted Bloom accompany him to a local notary public. He wanted to prepare a new will. Bloom told the court the Las Vegas notary public was neither the most meticulous nor smartest man. This was the first time he'd ever met Dennis Lloyd, and he'd never even heard of Markham, Ontario, hence the spelling errors. Barry found this more plausible than he cared to admit, but he wasn't ready to give up. It was now time to hear about the examination of the will itself. Dawson first checked the will to make sure nothing had been added or erased. It hadn't. Then he checked the watermark on the paper. If you hold up good paper to the light, you'll see a watermark, which is how paper is registered. Wills are usually prepared on good paper. The question was,
is it registered or not? If it is, then it will give us a date at which that watermark first came on the market. And if the will is dated 1978, for example, or 77, and I find that watermark never came on the market until 1980, we know right away this has been a backdated document.
The watermark was called Old Liverpool Bond. Checking the standard reference book, Dawson discovered it was not registered. This neither ruled the paper in nor out. Next, Dawson checked the typeface to see if it could be traced back to a particular typewriter.
The typeface, again, was very unusual. We still haven't ever seen a typeface such as this. All of the lowercase letters in this will were in script style. That is, it kind of looks like it's connected. It looks like it's very rounded handwriting, where each letter touches the next letter, except for the capital letters. All capital letters were in a monotone style.
Even to this day, Dawson has never seen another typeface like it. The uniqueness of both the watermark and the typeface could be argued for or against authenticity. It would now come down to one thing and one thing only: whether the signature was real or a forgery. $2 million was riding on it. This is one of Dennis Lloyd's known signatures. This is the one on the will. Were they the same? What do you think? $2 million, winner take all. It was now time for Greg Dawson's moment in the sun. Would he conclude the new will was genuine or a forgery? The judge added that if it was a forgery, then someone had committed a criminal act. There was no in-between. Handwriting is actually more brainwriting. It involves the subconscious. Your mind tells your hand what to write, but one seldom actually thinks, how do I make these characters? These hand movements are ingrained in us when we're quite young. Take an average classroom. Kids start to learn how to write trying to model the handwriting above the blackboard. But even after a very short time, when a teacher collects a class's papers, she can probably identify each student without looking at the name, because they've already begun to place their individual trademarks on their handwriting, a combination of artistic ability and physical ability that makes it uniquely theirs. By the time we've graduated high school, our handwriting is basically set. The nuts and bolts of what Greg Dawson does as a document examiner involves the careful study of one set of writings compared to another set and looking at the minutiae in order to determine whether or not they were written by the same person.
The first thing I do is to begin examining the signature under the microscope, and while I'm looking at it under the microscope, I'm drawing what I'm seeing. So I get a fairly intimate knowledge of the signature, and by looking at it under the microscope and drawing it myself, it's a working habit that forces me to concentrate and focus on the details of the writing.
Greg Dawson carefully compared the signatures.
The question signature starts here, and it begins here with a blunt beginning stroke, and it comes straight down, across here, up, then down, and then it terminates out here. In the known signature, you see it begins at an upstroke here, across here, 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 down, and then over this way. And much more quickly done. See the same movement in here, across, up, around, and then across here. And it ends with kind of a tapering stroke. This one ends with quite an abrupt stroke there. Again, in here, it starts again here with another blunt beginning stroke, and then comes up. The pen is lifted right here. At this point, the pen is raised off the page, and it's reaffixed to the page again at that particular location, and then carries on. In the known Lloyd signatures, it's beginning actually in this direction, comes up, it goes up very quickly, and then quickly down. And you can see the same thing here, it's just up, no pen lift in that particular location. It's an example of a pen lift in an unusual or odd location.
Then there was the question of slope.
You notice that it sloped just a little bit more than to the left than the known signatures. She is almost vertical, just a little wee bit off the 90 degrees. And these ones here were significantly more to the left than any of the other knowns that I had.
One other feature was intriguing.
Its location above the line. You notice that this signature is written quite a bit above the line. And the two knowns that I have here is pretty much right on, written right on this line. And the same with the signature down here.
Based on these factors, Greg Dawson was ready to render his decision.
The features here are classic indications of forgery. And in fact, in terms of skill of a forgery, this isn't even a very good job.
Following Dawson's testimony, all hell broke loose. Stanley Pavel announced he wanted to come clean and confess he's part in the conspiracy. Cassandra started screaming it was a lie. Zachary Bloom tried to calm everyone. Carolyn fainted. All four were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. Carolyn Lloyd swore the mastermind behind the whole conspiracy was lawyer Zachary Bloom, and that he'd come up with the idea of hiding the will in the Bible. For her cooperation, Bloom offered her $1 million, the family home, and a new car every 2 years. Stanley Pavel said he was offered $50,000, and since he was a real estate agent, Bloom promised him the commission from the sale of Dennis Lloyd's businesses. As for Bloom and Cassandra, investigators discovered they were lovers. They owned a small money-losing golf course together, and Bloom personally owed almost $200,000 to his law partners. If the will had gone through, they would have gotten Dennis Lloyd's paper business, which they planned to sell to pay off their debts.
There was some suggestion that this will was drafted in Detroit and that they had an expert forge the signature. If they did have an expert forger, they didn't get their money's worth, that's for sure.
The upshot of all this? Carolyn was sentenced to 1 day in prison and a year's probation. Stanley Pavel received the same sentence plus 3 months for perjury. Cassandra Edmonds was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but because of medical reasons never served time. And lawyer Zachary Bloom was disbarred and sentenced to four years in prison.
After all these years, this case is probably the most memorable one that I've had. It brought the whole excitement of forensic document examiner right to the fore for me. That case solidified my interest in this discipline, and I knew after doing that one, I'd never leave this work.
As for Barry Lloyd, by contesting the will, he thwarted a greedy scam and inherited his father's estate. He finally got a chance to bask in the knowledge that his father had truly loved him. It's amazing how much trouble can be caused by 6 little letters.
It's not like a domestic homicide where there's a smoking gun or a dripping knife.
The man was dead. Was it murder?
They can smell a carcass from over 1.5 miles away that you and I can't even smell yet, and we could be standing 10 feet from it.
No one had seen him, but there was a silent witness who would tell a gruesome tale.
This kind of investigation is a classic whodunit.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Exhibit A, a fly. Those pesky critters can be amazingly helpful when it comes to solving a murder where there is no confession and no eyewitness, at least not a human one. A dead body is found in the woods. The soft tissue around the eyes, nose, and mouth is swarming with bugs. Half his face and upper torso have been eaten away. There is no ID on or near the body. No way of identifying who he is, how he died, how many days he's been here, or how he's ended up 2 hours outside of Toronto in the middle of nowhere. With any unexplained death, homicide is brought in. This one seems suspicious.
There's not obvious signs of it being a murder. You know, there's not a smoking gun at the scene. In this particular case, though, just the circumstances, you've got a man clad only in his underwear in a wooded area with decomposition to his upper torso, mainly the neck and upwards. That itself sets off some warning bells.
Police send for a forensic entomologist, a specialist who collects and examines the flies and maggots found on dead bodies. Entomologist Neil Haskell is fond of saying, "If it dies, they will come," meaning that blowflies will zone in on a dead body instantly.
The ability to find a dead thing, to smell it, track upwind, and then find it is very powerful in the blowflies. They can smell a carcass from over 1.5 miles away that you and I can't even smell yet, and we could be standing 10 feet from it.
Neil Haskell should know. Haskell still lives on the same farm where he grew up. As a child, he became fascinated by the process of decomposition in dead livestock on his farm. Today, this childhood fascination has become his livelihood as a forensic entomologist. He scatters dead pig carcasses on various parts of the farm and observes how the insects colonize the decaying flesh. Haskell uses pigs for experiments because their body mass approximates that of humans. As a result, his observations can be accurately applied to his forensic work on dead humans.
Wow, she's really blown up since yesterday. Really good colonies of flies working on the nose, mouth, and eyes, which is what I would expect. Look at the maggot mass on the rear end. Literally tens of thousands of maggots.
It is hoped, with Haskell's scientific expertise, that investigators will learn about the time of death from the maggots found on the victim's body. But it would be a long process.
I did not find an anatomical cause of death, but what I found is consistent with manual strangulation resulting in asphyxia. That statement is based on the fact that the hyoid bone was broken. Pressure on the neck on both sides might fracture the bone.
The unknown man had been strangled, but why, when, and by whom? Investigators were to get 3 big breaks in this case. Fingerprints would be the first. One of the things that the maggots hadn't eaten away were the dead man's fingers. So the ident unit is able to take prints from the corpse. In Canada, anyone who's been fingerprinted is entered into a national database known as AFIS, or Automated Fingerprint Identification System. The dead man's prints were scanned onto the system. The AFIS database recognizes the minute characteristics which make up our unique fingerprint patterns.
In AFIS, if somebody is on that system, if we're comparing a print of somebody who's previously been loaded onto that system, then we will get a hit.
Police got lucky. They got a hit. They matched the dead man's prints with those of a man picked up out west for shoplifting.
Had our deceased never had contact with any police agency and his prints were not on AFIS, it would have been a longer procedure. It might have taken weeks, it might have taken months before we actually established the identity of the deceased.
His name was Mikhail Slotnick. Investigators recently learned that he was a Russian pilot who had been sponsored by a church group and placed on a farm out west. According to the couple who owned the farm, Mikhail was a hard worker with an easygoing nature who never complained. He stayed for a year, then set out for the nearby city of Edmonton. In the last letter the couple had gotten from him, they could tell that going to the city had been a big mistake. Isolated by language, Mikhail was lonely, plus he couldn't get a job. But none of this explained how Mikhail had ended up murdered in the middle of nowhere, half a continent away. Now that investigators knew the name of the deceased, they were able to run a search through databases and find Mikhail's bank account.
From the information we obtained from bank records, that led us to an address in Hamilton.
Hamilton, Ontario is a steel town an hour from Toronto, about 3 hours from where Mikhail's body was found.
We sent a team of investigators from our homicide office out to Hamilton to track down this address and to, at that point, try to get more information on the deceased.
The person living at the address on the bank records was Vladimir Yelman, Mikhail's friend and countryman. He was surprised to hear of Mikhail's death. Yelman explained that he'd met Mikhail in an Italian refugee camp while they were waiting to come to Canada. He'd lost track of him when he was sponsored by the farm couple out west. When Mikhail decided to come east and try his luck, Yelman invited him to move in. Together with another Russian pilot, Nikolai Andropov, the three became tight pals. But after getting a part-time job as a welder, Mikhail wanted his own place and moved out. It had been 2 weeks since Yelman had seen Mikhail. He had come over with a brand new car, a top-of-the-line Acura. Mikhail told Yelman his luck had changed and he was heading down to Florida for a month. Maybe 2, maybe forever. Yelman didn't know why he was leaving, nor where he had got the money for the new car. From Yelman, investigators got Mikhail's last address, a third-floor flat above a store. The landlord told detectives that he liked Mikhail and that he had lent him money after he recently lost his welding job. But 2 weeks ago, Mikhail paid back his debt in full. When investigators searched the apartment, they found it a mess, even though the landlord said Mikhail was neat and organized. Their conclusion? Mikhail must have left in a hurry.
We found certain items of significance, including a briefcase containing documents for the purchase of the vehicle, the owner's manual for that vehicle, and some pictures of the deceased, group pictures including friends.
Also, investigators sensed McHale's new Acura was becoming important. But where was it? It wasn't found near the body, nor at the apartment.
At that point, we don't have a car. We don't know where that car is, but the deceased is now developing an identity, a personality, and we're getting some idea of who he is.
An easygoing guy, tidy, hardworking, who'd suddenly come into enough money to buy a brand new car. Detectives checked the local dealership. There, they found the salesman who sold McHale the car 3 weeks earlier. He told investigators he'd been surprised when McHale had paid for the car in one lump sum. He had picked it up Saturday, the same Saturday he had first shown the car to his friends, the last day he had been seen alive. But where was the car now?
This kind of investigation is a classic whodunit. Every little piece of evidence can be referred to as a small pebble. The investigator wants to find that pebble and put it in a pile. And he wants to get every pebble he can. He doesn't want to overlook anything because the bigger that pile gets, the stronger the case is.
One of those pebbles would be the blowflies.
Morning. Dr. Neil Haskell?
Yes.
That'll package here for you, sir. Okay. First initial, last name.
The bugs had arrived in Indiana. The next move was to study them in his lab. From the specimens collected from the dead body, Haskell will try to identify the exact species of blowfly. There are over 90 different kinds.
Once you die, and you die in an environment that has accessibility to the blowflies, and the temperatures are high enough to support the activity of the blowflies, within a very short period of time, you're going to have maggots. Well, first of all, you're going to have the flies finding you, laying the eggs, and those eggs eventually hatching into maggots, and then starting that whole process then of the decomposition.
All of them proceed from egg to pupa to maggot, and finally to their metamorphosis as a fly. But each kind has a slightly different time frame for their life cycle. Since blowflies begin laying their eggs moments after death, it's possible to figure out when a person died, factoring in certain variables such as temperature. While blowflies have predictable life cycles, climate and temperatures can have a dramatic effect on the rate at which they develop on a corpse left in the open. That's why Haskell studies the bug activity on his pigs in different conditions. In the open sun, he finds lots of maggots.
This particular pig has been out approximately 2 weeks, about 14 days. And we see it's considerably well cleared of the soft tissue, all a result of the maggots themselves.
But in the adjacent wooded area, Haskell's pig carcasses are far less decomposed. The bugs are not nearly as active, even though these pigs have been left out for the same amount of time as those in the sun.
We do have a definite difference in the temperatures then that would drive the growth and development of the maggots that would be on this pig as opposed to the pig that had the thousands, tens of thousands of maggots in the open.
As Haskell continued his scientific study of the case, investigators uncovered more about McHale's financial dealings. McHale's bank account had one entry for $40,000 US. They traced it back to a businessman in Florida who claimed it was a retainer for McHale to secure new Russian business contacts for him. Now detectives knew why McHale was going to Florida. But Florida was in the opposite direction from the woods where his dead body had been discovered. Detectives also located McHale's downstairs neighbor. She described the strange noises she had heard 2 Saturdays ago, the Saturday McHale was allegedly sleeping upstairs before heading off for Florida. She was asleep. Around 3 a.m., she heard a noise. Someone was breaking into her apartment. Her mind raced, trying to think of what she would do to defend herself. Then she heard footsteps going up the stairs next door. A few minutes later, she heard a scuffle, then a strange noise. By the time she looked out, there was no one there. But the back door, which was always kept closed, was wide open. It all sounded like a murder might have happened upstairs that Saturday night. But one person's account, one who was not an eyewitness, was not enough to nail a murderer. Who had broken into the apartment that night? Who had murdered McHale, and where was the car? Investigators had hit a brick wall. They decided to put a photo of the car on TV and seek the public's help. They were about to get their second big break. A shipping clerk called police saying she recognized the car as the one she had shipped to the Soviet city of St. Petersburg.
So that was a very big break because that created a paper trail. And a break like that speeds up an investigation because we've now got a tangible route to follow, something we can hang our hat on. Now we want to find this car.
St. Petersburg had a thriving black market in cars. They were worth 3 or 4 times their value, plus they didn't require registration. Though detectives still lacked any suspects, they now had a motive: greed. Then came the third big break. The detective showed the shipping clerk a picture of McHale to find out if he was the one who shipped the car. The clerk said she didn't recognize McHale, but she did point out and drop off.
Bells went off at that point because that individual had already been interviewed by myself and my partner, Detective Arbor. That person did not mention to us, oh, by the way, I shipped the vehicle of the deceased to Russia. Big turning point in the investigation.
But investigators hadn't nailed the case just yet. Another branch of forensics was about to enter the story. At the time of the autopsy, 11 tiny orange fibers had been found on McHale's body.
One of the officers remembered having seen an orange carpet in one of the suspect's apartment.
Investigators got a sample of that orange carpet and sent it to Joanne Ulmer at the Center for Forensic Sciences to compare it with the fibers found on McHale's corpse.
On one side, you'll have the mounted fibers of your known sample. On the other side, you'll have the mounted unknown fibers. You then examine them under a split screen and compare the color and other morphological characteristics to see if they're similar to each other. These T-shaped cross-sectional fibers I'd never seen before. In my 10 years here and the hundreds of cases I've done, I had never seen them. No one I knew here had ever seen them. And I had to conclude that the carpet fibers found on the deceased's body were consistent with originating from the same source as the carpet from the suspect's apartment.
Who was that suspect? Vladimir Yelman. When detectives questioned Yelman about why he hadn't mentioned anything about shipping McHale's car to Russia, Yelman claimed it was because he was afraid of getting McHale in trouble. Yelman insisted that McHale had asked him that Sunday to ship the car. And drop-off later corroborated Yelman's story. Despite the accumulation of convincing circumstantial evidence, the Crown's case would rest on establishing an accurate time of death. Neil Haskell hadn't weighed in yet. Could his evidence disprove the suspect's story and nail McHale's killer?
One of the most important aspects of doing forensic entomology is the assessment of the temperatures from the specific habitat at the scene itself.
Haskell obtained detailed data from a weather station near the site where McHale's body was found. He compared this to the temperature data he had monitored at the actual site to see how different the two were. When everything was factored in, he concluded that McHale's body had been in the woods 11 days. Working backwards, it put the murder early Sunday morning. But Yelman and Andropov insisted that late Sunday, McHale had asked him to ship his car to Russia. But the blowflies said McHale had already been dead by then, and blowflies don't lie. After all this information was gathered, this is what investigators believe happened that night. On the same Saturday that McHale had picked up his car, he told his friends about his plans to drive to Florida. He arrived home about 10 to get his stuff and maybe catch a little shut-eye. Whenever he woke up, he would start out for Florida. Around 3 in the morning, they broke into his place. Police surmised that Yelman, who had studied martial arts, dispensed with him quickly. They then lifted him out of bed, dumped him into the trunk of a car, and drove to a place in the middle of nowhere. They bought a new owner's manual. Remember, McHale's was left in his briefcase. Then they shipped the car to St. Petersburg. Yelman and Andropov were arrested. The fibers linked them to the body, and the bugs helped eat away their alibi. Both men were tried and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life.
This work has, in this profession as a forensic entomologist, has to be the most exciting thing I have ever done in my life, and it's the most challenging. Every day is like Christmas to me. I kid you not. I can be sitting in the laboratory trying to finish up a case. The phone will ring, and I'm off on a new adventure.
Is there a connection between the world of bugs and the human world? At our worst, do we feed on each other in the name of survival? Or is it really greed? Mikhail Slotnick was murdered by his friends and countrymen for a car. As Shakespeare said, like flies to wanton boys, we are to the gods, they kill us for their sport. So the next time you kill a fly, remember, you might be killing an expert witness. It was an era of swing, of high-button shoes, of streetcars and horses, and of grisly murder. Who was the victim? Who was the murderer? Could science solve a 50-year-old mystery? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Suppose you found out that your mother, who you always thought had abandoned you as a child, had really been murdered. Exhibit A, a human skull. It started at a Toronto landmark, Danforth Motors, an auto dealership since 1949. In 1995, when the dealership is being demolished to make way for a senior citizens' home, underneath what had been the cement showroom floor, workmen find a skull. The workmen call police, who arrive to secure the site. The crucial question, who lay buried underneath the showroom floor? Police send for Professor Jerry Melby, a specialist in skeletal remains.
By the time I got there, a great deal of the skeleton had been disturbed. There was a pair of women's shoes, and there was hair. So we were suspicious immediately that it was a woman. A young boy, about 9 years old or so, came up to me and said, "Have you got a body over there?" And I says, "Well, looks like, I'm not sure." And he says, "Well, I'll tell you what you do. Look at her teeth, and you can get a positive identification." Boy, everybody's a forensic scientist. He's quite right, of course.
The kid may have watched too much TV, but he was on the right track. The records for missing persons didn't go back beyond the 50s, so in this case, dental information provided a major piece of the puzzle.
The denture was very revealing because it was made of vulcanite rubber, and this was a material that was used through the 1940s and 1950s.
Melby knew the auto showroom had been built in 1949.
Taking those two pieces of information, the victim had to be buried between 1940 and 1949. 1940 when the vulcanite rubber was first introduced, and 1949 when the cement pad was built.
The 40s in Toronto, the war and post-war years. Horses, cars, and streetcars competed for road space. Swing was in. Back then, Danforth Avenue was on Toronto's outskirts, a decidedly working-class neighborhood. These days, Danforth Avenue is a Greek area on the cusp of gentrification. Remnants of that era still exist in the houses, the old bus depot, and even the local tavern. Because the bones had been found on Danforth Avenue, the press dubbed her the Danforth Lady. The more Melby examined the bones, the more he was hooked by the mystery. Out of the 206 bones that comprise the human body, Melby collected 114. Having decided gender, which was easy, he tried to determine age, which is more difficult with adults.
We change more slowly as adults, and some of us age a little bit more quickly.
His guesstimate, she was between 20 and 40. Stature, usually that's easy, just measuring one of the long bones and applying mathematical formulas. But with the Danforth Lady, the best the anthropologist could say was 5 foot 2 inches to 5 foot 8 inches, which he admitted could encompass an enormous percentage of the female population. Then there was a question of race.
Race, that's the most difficult question. There's not much difference in humans when we're looking under the skin.
But from the statistical probability in the area, Melby guessed she was probably Caucasian. The question was, had this been the burial site of an old homestead or even a cemetery? To Melby, the irregularity of the burial suggested a secret, makeshift grave.
That suggested right there that I was dealing with someone that had dug a clandestine grave.
This fit perfectly with Melby's most startling discovery. The Danforth Lady had been murdered.
There was a number of wounds on the skull that were reminiscent of a hammer, or at least a blunt instrument, very similar to a hammer.
There were 7 blows to the skull, blows that had penetrated the skull.
Multiple blows like this strongly suggest that there is a great deal of rage involved on the part of the perpetrator.
The whole picture was a red-headed woman between 20 and 40, between 5 foot 2 inches and 5 foot 8 inches, with a vulcanite dental plate, who had been murdered between the years 1940 and 1949. While investigators pursued the leads they got from the public, researchers combed through newspaper reports of the day, compiling lists of missing women. As lead after lead fell through, the prime candidate became Edith Parks, a 25-year-old stenographer. Edith Parks came from a notorious family. In one of Toronto's most sensational trials of the 1930s, her father was convicted of intentionally drowning her 2-year-old brother. In May of 1949, Edith Parks was seen leaving her flat on a Monday morning. She never arrived at work and was never heard from again. Interest in Edith's disappearance grew when police learned that she had an upper dental plate just like the Danforth lady. Scientists thought they might be able to determine the Danforth lady's identity from the DNA in her teeth. If investigators could locate some of Edith's relatives and get their samples of DNA, they might be able to confirm that the Danforth lady was Edith Parks. The search surpassed investigators' expectations. They found several of Edith's relatives. They also found Edith, alive and well, living in upstate New York. If only they could get a picture of the Danforth lady's face. Melby knew there was one lab in the world which could take a skull and turn it into a computer-assisted photograph. Luckily, that lab was only a half-hour drive from his office. Betty Clark is an artist who works for the Metropolitan Toronto Police. Over the years, she has had incredible success tracking down criminals and missing children with the aid of a special program called the Computer Assisted Recovery Enhancement System. Using the computer program, Betty Clark can take a photograph of a missing person and predict what he or she will look like aged several years. But this time, there is no photograph, no eyewitness description. All Betty Clark has to go on is the Danforth lady's skull. The first step was to study photos of the skull from every angle.
This tells you a lot. It's a very large head, quite a prominent nose on the bridge, and there's a large overbite with a space between the front teeth. So right away we have really good description without even constructing the face.
She enlarged the photos so she could see the details of the bones.
And then I will do an overlay and then proceed with a drawing. The drawing is to establish to myself what the features of this person will be. And once I have a satisfactory image, then I can do research and find the actual photographic parts that I will replace as a composite.
Then she scans the image into the computer and replaces each feature with those taken from her photo files, sometimes using details from 3 or 4 photos to create just the right cheek or the right hairstyle.
The first thing I always start with are the eyes. They're the soul to the body. I always consider the nose one of the most important features of the face. It really makes the character. But there's so little information left on the skeleton to tell you what the nose might have looked like that I either make it too small, or I make it too large, or too wide, or too narrow. And when we've had proof back as to what that person really looked like, if there's one feature that's always been incorrect, it's the nose. She had a large gap in her teeth, plus from 40 years ago, I'll reconstruct this face, but with no makeup, because there wasn't a lot of use of makeup in those days. I asked a friend in the office about hairstyles, and she was able to come in with photographs of her family's pictures from 40 years ago, and that greatly enhanced the composite while I was working on it, because the hairstyle makes a big difference.
The composite of the Danforth lady is published in all the local newspapers.
You sit there and you wait because now someone has to positively identify this. So you're sitting on pins and needles.
Bob Burns, a retired teacher, saw the photograph in the newspaper and called police. His mother, Molly Burns, who had disappeared in 1943, was 5'5" with dark red hair and a vulcanite dental plate. But what really caught investigators' attention was a photo of his parents on a railway pass issued about a month before his mother disappeared. His mother's likeness to Betty Clark's composite photo was uncanny. The Burns family home was only about 10 blocks from the site where the bones had been found. Molly Burns did laundry to make ends meet, and when his older brother wasn't around, Bobby helped. Bobby remembered his mother's laugh. And how she loved to dance. Love to drink. Bobby was 10 when his father told him one morning his mother had left and wasn't coming back. He never said why. Was Molly Burns really the Danforth lady? Bob and his brother were asked to give blood samples so that their DNA could be compared with that of the Danforth ladies. Even if the DNA confirmed the Danforth lady's identity, there was still the compelling question of murder. Talk about your cold trail. This one was 50 years old. But investigators were now determined to solve the mystery. Police told Bob the DNA results could take from 4 to 6 weeks to process. Scientists first tried to extract DNA from one of the Danforth lady's molar teeth.
This is usually the very best because the pulp chamber of the tooth is completely surrounded by enamel, and that enamel is the hardest substance in the human body, so there's very little chance of contamination. The result came up negative. So we took a sample out of the thigh bone, the marrow cavity, scraped that and sent that to the CFS.
No luck. The Danforth lady was stubbornly holding on to her mystery.
All DNA degrades, all DNA breaks down. So in a very old specimen, such as the Iceman, such as the bones from the Romanov grave, such as DNA from mummies from 2,000 years ago. All of the genomic or nuclear DNA from those ancient specimens will be gone. It will have disappeared.
This is what had happened with the Danforth lady. But luckily, there's another type of DNA. Nuclear DNA, the one commonly used, is taken from both parents' lineage. But what is called mitochondrial DNA is only taken from the mother's side.
That means that my DNA will be the same as my sister's and brother's DNA, and all of that will be the same as our mother's DNA, which will be the same as her mother's DNA, which will be the same as her mother's DNA, etc.
Investigators, meanwhile, had located Molly's younger sister, Sarah. She told investigators that Molly's husband, Henry, was an assistant blacksmith who had trouble keeping a job. That's why, to make ends meet, Molly took in laundry. Henry, like Molly, also enjoyed his booze. It made for a stormy marriage. Especially given Henry's jealous streak, he was always accusing Molly of flirting with someone. Sarah always thought this was just Henry's jealous streak. The last time Sarah saw Molly, was the summer of '43 at their mother's. Later, Sarah would remember something fishy about that day. Molly was taking a long time putting on her makeup. It wasn't like her to do herself up if she was just taking the streetcar home to her family. It must have been a few days after that Henry came out to her place and told them Molly had never come home from her visit. Henry was convinced Molly had run off with someone. Molly's mother placed advertisements in local newspapers, pleading with her daughter to come back home. She never got an answer. Now she knew why. Was Molly meeting the person who ultimately murdered her? And why had her body been discovered back in her old neighborhood? Bob Burns had talked to his older brother. What they'd pieced together put quite a different spin on the story of their mother's disappearance. The last time they'd seen their mother was a Saturday night in 1943. Molly and Henry had gone to their usual watering hole. His mother wanted to dance. Henry was talking to a buddy. So his mother found another partner. In 1943, even on Saturday nights, Toronto had strict liquor laws requiring places to close early. So his parents invited the gang back to their place to continue the party. At some point during the party, Henry went looking for Molly. When he caught her with the waiter, a fight broke out. Afterwards, his parents had a major row. The following morning, Bobby's father told him his mother had left and wasn't coming back. He never said why. In this new light, it seemed Henry had motive and opportunity. And the murder weapon was a hammer. A readily available weapon for someone who worked as a blacksmith's assistant. Case solved? Not so fast. The first rule in any investigation is not to jump to conclusions. Henry Burns didn't have a car. So how could he possibly have carried Molly's body the 10 blocks from the house to where the body was found without being seen? As investigators pondered this, results came back from the mitochondrial DNA test. It confirmed that the DNA of the unearthed skeletal bones was consistent with Bob's DNA. The Danforth lady finally had a name: Molly Burns. But what about the last mystery? While Henry may not have had a car, as a blacksmith he certainly had access to horses. Maybe that's how he transported Molly's body after he killed her. For 50 years, Bob had believed his mother had abandoned them. His older brother used to joke to his wife, "We must have been rotten kids." Bob never suspected his mother had been murdered. It makes me feel a lot better to know that she didn't abandon me, he said. It's a big relief to know what happened to her. Small consolation, perhaps, but it helped to unburden the child inside the man.
One of the interesting things that we learn in this field is that no death goes unnoticed in our society, and we don't give up easy. When we find a dead person and we don't know who it is, we really want to know who it is and how she died and who did it. Yeah. It's important. At least it seems important to me.
Thanks to advances in forensic science, the most important questions have been answered. Molly Burns can now be finally laid to rest. Her babies were dying. No one knew why.
You know, if you're a grieving parent, society has something special for you.
SIDS was the recently coined term for all unexplained infant deaths.
Oh my Lord, he's 2.5. How could anybody call that SIDS or you know, not be suspicious?
My only answer to those people was I couldn't give away 5 free murders.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Every year in North America, thousands of healthy babies die for no apparent reason. It's frustrating for the doctors and devastating for the parents. In the small town of Owego, New York, it happened 3 times to the same family. Juanetta and Tim Hoyt's first child, Eric, had breathing problems and died at 3 months. Their second, Julie, choked to death on cereal at 4 months. Days later, 2.5-year-old Jimmy cried out, "Mommy," and suddenly died. Most people assumed the Hoyts would give up on having children. But 6 months later, Juanetta was pregnant again. When 1-month-old Molly turned blue and had to be resuscitated, their family doctor urged the Hoyts to consult Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, an upstate specialist doing research into SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. In the early 70s, SIDS was the recently coined term for all unexplained infant deaths.
What we knew about SIDS was almost nothing. Surprisingly enough, it had been around for as far back as recorded history. There's, I think, Solomon's case in the Bible had to do with a SIDS case. And yet, somehow, we hadn't put it together that all these children dying without explanation were a cluster of children with a specific problem.
Though SIDS was a mystery, Steinschneider believed it was connected to apnea, short but dangerous pauses in breath. Apnea was common in infants, and it seemed to him that all of Juanetta's babies had had breathing problems. Steinschneider's solution? Admit Molly to his clinic and attach her to an apnea monitor. If she stopped breathing, even for an instant, an alarm would sound. As Juanetta and Tim went home that day, they hoped against hope Steinschneider was on the right track. Already in their young marriage, they'd been through a lifetime of heartbreak. At Steinschneider's clinic, Molly's monitor sometimes goes off 20 times a day, often for no good reason.
Is it abnormal? Newborn babies don't breathe evenly. They just don't. They breathe sometimes quick, shallow breaths, and then they'll not take one, and they'll take a big, deep breath, and then they'll wait a while, and then they'll breathe again. So what we have to distinguish is apnea, which is pauses, from pathological apnea, which means that the pause is long enough so that the body notices that there's no oxygen coming in.
Steinschneider's experiment seems to be working. Molly has no serious apnea incidents, and she is getting stronger. But each time Molly is brought home, she suffers a serious apneic episode. Juanetta persuades Dr. Steinschneider to lend her an apnea machine, making Molly the first baby in the world to have a home monitor. But still, tragedy strikes. By the time Juanetta responds to the alarm, 2-month-old Molly is dead. After consulting a colleague about Molly's lungs, the pathologist lists cause of death as pneumonia.
A lot of times what pathologists and others would do is give it a name, even though they knew that isn't what caused it. So they'd tell them it was pneumonia or it was a virus. So that parents frequently weren't told that nobody knew specifically. I think that folks had a tendency to believe that some answer is better than no answer.
Juanetta blames herself. If only she hadn't left Molly alone. Tim wonders if his father's alcoholism hasn't screwed up his genes. But to Dr. Steinschneider, the real cause of death is SIDS. More than that, he convinces Juanetta there is no reason why she can't have another child. 2 months later, Juanetta is pregnant again. This time, as soon as Noah, their 5th child, is born, he is hooked up to an apnea monitor at Steinschneider's clinic. Each time the infant goes home, he's brought back to the hospital having suffered a severe apneic episode. The nurse notes that Juanetta is noticeably detached from the infant. But after losing 4 children, perhaps she's afraid to bond too closely. Still, when Dr. Steinschneider decides it's time for Juanetta to take Noah home again, the nurse argues against it. She insists there's something unnatural about Juanetta, something unmotherly about how she relates to her children. In her frustration, the nurse bets Steinschneider Noah won't survive. Noah dies the next day while Juanetta is in the shower. Cause of death is listed as acute bronchiolitis. But to Steinschneider, it's another SIDS case. Tragic as the deaths are, Steinschneider is positive he's on the right track about the link between apnea and SIDS. Steinschneider publishes an article based on the Hoyts in a respected medical journal. Given that 5 of Juanetta's children died of SIDS, his paper states SIDS is genetic and runs in families. Within a few years, he is the leading authority on SIDS. Some townfolk and even some of Juanetta's relatives gossip about the fact that each of Juanetta's children died when she was the only one home. But if Dr. Steinschneider says the deaths are SIDS related, who are they to question the esteemed doctor? Besides, the alternative is unthinkable. Exhibit A, Steinschneider's SIDS paper. the ultimate defense against any suggestion that Juanetta was in any way responsible for the death of her babies. Ironically, many years later, it became the key piece of evidence that ultimately solved the mystery of how Juanetta's babies really died. After all 5 of their children died of SIDS, Tim Hoyt had a vasectomy. Juanetta still wanted children. 5 years after Noah's death, she and Tim adopted a 2-month-old baby. They took turns staying up at night to make sure nothing happened. If SIDS was genetic, this baby should be fine. Meanwhile, Dr. Steinschneider became the patron saint of SIDS. His apnea theory was quoted in dozens of pediatric journals and parenting magazines. Juanetta took solace in the fact that her tragic experience was the basis of Steinschneider's famous article. Home monitors became a multi-million-dollar business. As time passed, Juanetta concentrated on honoring her dead children and raising her adopted child. Juanetta had no idea that a criminal case in the next county was about to refocus attention on how her children really died. The DA was prosecuting a man accused of murdering his 3 infants for the insurance money. The defense cited Steinschneider's article about the Hoyts' 5 infant deaths as proof that SIDS ran in families. The DA's pediatric expert countered that 1 death in a family might be SIDS. 2 were possible, but 3 were homicide. The jury agreed, and the man was convicted. The DA called Bob Simpson, the district attorney for Owego, New York. He suggested the Hoyt children hadn't died of SIDS. They'd been murdered.
It's not something you can simply say, oh, well, I don't believe it, therefore we're not going to do anything about it. When you have a credible person come forward and tell you that there's a possibility of homicides, then you obviously get a group going and you get working on it.
District Attorney Simpson collected the Hoyt children's medical records and sent them to Dr. Michael Baden, former chief medical examiner in New York. Eric Hoyt hadn't been autopsied, so there was no way anyone could have determined his death was the result of a congenital anomaly of the heart. Julie's death was the result of eating rice cereal, but infants her age don't eat rice cereal. Jimmy's death allegedly was the result of an enlarged thymus, but Dr. Baden pointed out this is common in healthy young children. There were slides of Molly's lungs, but there was no evidence of pneumonitis, and there was no evidence of Noah's acute bronchiolitis. Dr. Baden studied the reports and pronounced them homicides. But before Bob Simpson accused Juanetta Hoyt of the worst crime a mother could commit, he wanted a second opinion. He wanted an expert on infanticide, someone who combined the skills of a forensic pathologist and a pediatrician.
If you look at the medical records, and I went through every single line, there was nothing in the records that supported that these children had anything wrong with them at all. Anything.
SIDS was usually defined as an unexplained death for an infant under 1 year old. So what really caught Dr. Ophoven's attention was Jimmy Hoyt's death.
Oh my Lord, he's 2.5. How could anybody call that, SIDS or not be suspicious? There was clearly no other cause of death or circumstance of death that can be reasonably considered except murder.
But what seemed hardest for anyone to understand was how a mother could possibly hurt her offspring. That's when Dr. Ophoven brought up the term Munchausen's by proxy.
We now know that there are people who hurt their children on purpose in secret ways to get some gratification from being the parent or the grieving parent of a sick child. Society holds those people in some esteem and regard. If you're a grieving parent, society has something special for you.
If Munchausen's by proxy offered a perverse reason why Juanetta killed her babies, 2.5-year-old Jimmy's medical records indicated how she'd done it.
the child was otherwise normal that day, then all of a sudden either came inside or jumped up, yelled mommy, and dropped dead on the floor. When you're looking at sudden death and you're looking at blood in the nose and mouth, that's a pretty classic description of someone who's been suffocated. That did it for me. I mean, to suffocate a 2.5-year-old takes a great deal of intention.
I was absolutely amazed that something like this could happen. At that time, I'd been a policeman 30 years, and I had never encountered a case such as this.
Yet, despite the seemingly heinous nature of Juaneta's crime, there was tremendous pressure to sweep the whole case under the carpet. Her adopted child was now a teenager and seemed perfectly healthy. And most of Juaneta's neighbors felt she had suffered enough already.
There were comments that were made to me and to my colleagues to the effect, why were we bothering this woman? And my only answer to those people was I couldn't give away 5 free murders.
In the years since the deaths of Juaneta's children, most of the coroners and doctors involved in the case had died. Given the very nature of the crime, there would be no witnesses. So Simpson and Courtwright knew the case would boil down to one thing and one thing only: getting Juaneta to confess. They also knew that mothers in infanticide cases rarely ever confessed. Inspector Courtwright planned his strategy like a military campaign. He handpicked Trooper Bob Bleck, an officer who personally knew Juaneta, and Sue Mulvey, his only female investigator.
I wanted a mother-to-mother interview. Sue had a child, and I felt she could relate to Juanita maybe better than I could.
At the station house, Bob Courtwright joins Juaneta, Bleck, and Mulvey. Without breaking the mood or making her suspicious, Trooper Bleck reads Juaneta her rights.
If she had confessed before we read her rights, that could never be used against her. We started out, and it took about an hour, going through the lives of the children, some of the marriage in Juanita's life.
The interview is non-accusatory, but at a signal by Bob Courtwright, Sue Mulvey segues into the topic of murders. This is the big moment.
We told her that we had medical evidence that showed that she caused the death of her children. She denied that, said they died of SIDS. Investigator Mulvey was doing the interview at this time and persisted that we know she caused the death of her children, and we have medical evidence to prove it. At one point, she dropped her head, started crying, and says, "What will people think of me? They'll throw me in the gutter. What will my husband think of me? He'll hate me." Sue was very consoling, and she started to confess to the murder of her children. Eric was the first baby to die. She says she has smothered him on the couch in the living room of her mother-in-law's. Julie was the next to die. She said she held Julie to her chest with her mouth and nose against her chest until she stopped breathing, and she was dead.
2.5-year-old Jimmy was next.
She said she was in the bathroom getting dressed and that James was crying and pounding on the door. She said she took him out in the living room and smothered him on the floor with a bath towel. The next to die was Molly. She smothered Molly with a pillow. She couldn't stand the crying.
And then there was Noah.
I think he'd been home from the hospital for 12 hours after spending most of his life there. And she said she smothered him with a pillow, too. We treated her with compassion, and there's not much else we could do except take down that confession. It was absolutely riveting.
2 police officers had picked Tim up at work and brought him to the station house. He was furious when he entered the room.
I told him, your wife has admitted to suffocating all your children. And he says, that's a lie. You made her say that. He's very upset. And I said, no. I says, here's a statement that she has given us, and I want you to read it. And he sat down next to his wife and read that statement.
Juanetta Hoyt was charged with 5 counts of murder. At her trial, Dr. Steinschneider testified for the defense. He still insisted that SIDS was genetic and that all of Juanetta's children had died of SIDS.
I think he hurt himself and hurt the defendant when he took the stand and tried to keep to his old ideas and not recognize, A, that there was change, and B, that Mrs. Hoyt had confessed to the homicides. He refused to even acknowledge that her confession may alter his underlying findings.
Of all the deaths, 2.5-year-old Jimmy's affected people the most.
Jimmy was 2 years, 4 months old at the time of his murder. I had 2 grandsons about that age at the time. And to envision this 2.5-year-old being smothered, he's going to put on a fight for his life, in which he did from the words of Juanita herself. I think that that gripped me the most of all the deaths. Intellectually, he knew what was going on, where the babies maybe weren't so far advanced intellectually, but Jimmy knew.
Juanetta Hoyt was convicted of all 5 murders and given 5 consecutive 15-year sentences. Why did Juanetta do it? Maybe, as she said, she just couldn't stand the crying. Maybe she liked the attention of being pregnant but just didn't like the responsibility of raising kids. Maybe it was a form of Munchausen's by proxy.
Munchausen's by proxy is just a particularly sinister form of child abuse. It is hurting children. That's all it is. It's hurting children.
What about her husband, Tim? How did he fit into all this?
I would think if 5 of your children died, and they kept dying, that you might ask your wife some questions. All these children died while he was working. Myself as a husband, I think I'd ask my wife, what's going on here?
In August 1998, Juanetta Hoyt died of cancer while serving a life sentence. SIDS is certainly a real and genuine tragedy for many families, but in the years since Juanetta's trial, it's estimated that in North America, about 1 in 10 cases a year are infanticide disguised as SIDS. Science in the service of society is wonderful, but when science is flawed, it can mask the unthinkable. How else to explain why Juanetta Hoyt almost got away with 5 murders? They wore balaclavas, black as evil, with no eye holes. They stole guns, then they were trigger happy. People were going to die. Could investigators and forensic scientists identify the gunman and put an end to their deadly spree? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. On September 14, 1994, the lives of two women who had never met were forever and irreparably intertwined through a series of cold-blooded murders. Danielle Thomas and her husband Ken had come to Canada from South Africa to start a new life for themselves and their teenage daughter. Danielle worked in a dress shop. Ken was a carpenter. Whenever Ken worked late, he would let himself in, then come up to the bedroom and ask Danielle if she wanted coffee or tea. It was the small things she would most remember. Natalie Pardee and her husband Roger had two teenage sons, and they were partners in every sense, both in their marriage and in their family-run gun shop. Natalie's last living memory of Roger was 20 minutes before the holdup. Around 5, a customer pulled into the store's parking lot and saw two armed figures wearing balaclavas. He scribbled down the car's license plate number and raced off to call police. The first gunman bounded into the store and yelled, "Get your hands in the air, this is a holdup." A shocked employee said, "You're kidding." The bandit answered, "I'm not kidding," and shot him in the arm. Then he whirled, wounded one customer and fired at another. Roger Pardee whispered into the phone, "Call the police, we're being held up," and he was shot point blank. Then the second gunman entered, shouting, "If anyone moves, kill him." He smashed a gun case and scooped out 11 handguns. The first gunman barked, "That's enough, let's go." In less than a minute, 4 people had been shot. One of them, Roger Pardee, was dead. Investigators learned that the balaclavas the gunmen wore didn't have eye holes, so no one could describe their ethnicity, their gender, not even the color of their eyes. What did register with the witnesses was the cold-bloodedness of the shorter of the two gunmen, the one who had done all the shooting. His gun had been equipped with a silencer, indicating he was anticipating using it. He hadn't fired a warning shot, never aimed below the torso, had no interest in the cash register. Instead, he had been fixated on clearing a path to the gun cabinet for his taller cohort, no matter the cost.
Brutality of it was striking. The intent of these robbers were to get what they wanted, and they had no hesitation about killing anyone.
After the victims were removed, forensic ident photographed the scene and searched for clues. Police had an excellent description of the gunman's semi-automatic weapon.
We then knew that a number of shots had been fired with inside the store and with a semi-automatic firearm. So we concentrate our first efforts in locating any type of shell casings which may have been ejected from the gun.
At the Center of Forensic Sciences, a ballistic expert checked the casings under a comparison microscope. All 7 rounds were .22 caliber, all fired from the same gun. Natalie Pardee had witnessed the start of the holdup. She ran to push the panic button in the back room and came back just as the gunmen were leaving the store. The incident had taken less than a minute, but the nightmare would last forever. Danielle Thomas's nightmare was about to begin. Police had traced a license plate on the getaway car back to her husband, Ken. An officer dropped by around 10 and asked if Ken was home. When Danielle said he wasn't, She was told that Ken's car had been used in a nearby robbery and murder. What they didn't tell Mrs. Thomas was that they were suspicious Ken might have been one of the balaclavaed gunmen. She kept thinking whoever had committed the crime had stolen Ken's car. She expected Ken would show up at any minute or phone her asking to be picked up somewhere. She sat up the whole night waiting. The next day, police found Ken's car in a lot about a 5-minute drive from the gun shop. They checked out the trunk, fearful they might find Ken's body. They did find traces of blood on the passenger side. Was it Ken's? Greg McAllister, one of the ident officers, had a hunch. He returned to the scene of the crime.
In examining the gun cabinet, you can see that the glass is about a 1/4 inch thick. Any person, regardless of the garment they're wearing, is certainly running a risk of cutting themselves.
For the next 3 hours, he went through every piece of glass, visually inspecting each one. Finally, he hit pay dirt. On 3 pieces, he found small trace amounts of blood. A sample was sent to the biology lab at the Center of Forensic Sciences. A DNA analysis of that blood was compared to the blood sample found in the getaway car. They matched. Investigators now knew it came from the taller perpetrator. But if the blood wasn't from Ken Thomas, where was he? Had he been involved in the robbery homicide? Or had he been kidnapped? Or worse? Just how did Ken Thomas fit in with the 2 masked killers? 10 days after the murder of her husband, Natalie Party was allowed back into their gun shop. Now, the irony of their owning a gun shop in Canada is that they had never even considered keeping a gun for protection. A cleanup crew had been sent in after the police had collected all the evidence they needed. But there were still traces of blood where Roger had been shot. Daniil Thomas, meanwhile, was dealing with the pain of waiting. He'd been last seen near the bank around noon on the day of the robbery murder. Police had received reports that Ken's car had been spotted near the gun shop around 2. Then again at 3, and again at various intervals up until 5. But Ken Thomas had not been identified as one of the occupants. At night, Daniil heard Ken's key in the front door. Heard his familiar footsteps on the stairs. Heard him open the door to the bedroom and ask if she wanted coffee or tea. But it was only a trick of the mind. Something between sleep and hope. Investigators started checking out some of their most notorious criminals, local bike gangs, and known drug dealers. Surprisingly, these groups were more than willing to prove their innocence by providing blood samples and polygraphs. So who were the gunmen?
It seemed that every time you went around a corner, there was more information to be investigated, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
It was like you were in a marathon, and you went home exhausted every night. Knowing full well that the families would want to know at some point how it was going and what you were doing.
By November, Natalie Party had started working in the gun shop again. It still held wonderful memories of her and Roger, and she found it comforting, as if Roger was still there. But by November, police cautioned Daniil that her husband was probably dead. But she refused to give in to despair. refused to give up hope. Then on January 21st, almost 4 months after the robbery homicide, a fisherman near Lake Ontario discovered a body in a fenced-in bird sanctuary. Was it Ken Thomas? A pair of work boots stood nearby, and a pair of jeans had been thrown on the body. A winter storm was coming in off the lake so quickly, it seemed the investigators might not get a chance to properly examine the site. They scrambled to erect a tent.
Within minutes after getting the tent set up, it began to snow. And if in fact, there's little doubt in my mind had we not got the tent set up at that time, the remains of this person would have been buried in snow for months, and we may not have uncovered him until spring or summer.
Inside the tent, the ident officers could study the dead body.
His face and hair had virtually decayed away just from the exposure to the elements. In examining his skull, it was quite obvious that he had suffered gunshot wounds or head injuries, which viewing were definitely gunshot wounds to the head.
Sensing that it had been an execution-style murder, detectives called in Ontario's Deputy Chief Coroner.
There was one to the left side of the skull, which entered roughly in this region. 2 bullets entered and formed a conjoint or joined entrance wound a little to the front of this other wound. Within the skull, there was 1 bullet recovered, and there were 2 exit wounds located on the right side of the skull.
There was also a significant wound in the back half of the C1 vertebrae.
It would have involved the spinal cord, resulting in immediate incapacitation, and thereafter travels into the back of the facial bones and exits likely from the nose area.
Embedded in the dirt under the body, investigators recovered a bullet. Under a comparison microscope, it matched the bullets that had killed Roger Pardee. But it was the detective's last observation that would be particularly chilling.
I saw his watch still running, but it was an hour off. We had switched to daylight savings time by that time in January. When Mr. Thomas went missing, it was still standard time.
Investigators now surmised that Ken Thomas's killers had carjacked him at the bank and driven him to the bird sanctuary, where he'd been forced to scramble under the fence. Then they ordered him to remove his clothes, saying this was so he couldn't follow them. As he was taking off his shirt, they shot him. Then shot him 3 more times at very close range on the left side of his temple. The scenario was horrific. It suggested that Ken Thomas had likely been murdered hours before the 2 gunmen staged their brutal holdup. It also meant that during all the months that Danielle had hoped and prayed for her husband's safe return, he'd been dead. But investigators had hit a wall as far as the clues to the identity of the gunmen. It was time to start looking outside the region. They could be anywhere in Canada, anywhere at all in North America.
There'd be nights you'd go home and you'd sit in front of the fireplace, or you'd sit quietly, look out the window, and you'd kind of methodically go through your investigation and think, is there something we've missed? Have we missed something so obvious? Maybe we should go and go in this direction. And you're constantly doing that.
You live, eat, and breathe this investigation.
As the saying goes, if you have a gun in a drawer in Act 1 of a drama, it's sure to go off in Act 3. The same can be said of a stash of 11 stolen handguns. They were bound to go off somewhere, sometime. 6 months after the murders, and a 3-hour drive away, a woman called the London, Ontario police and said that 2 gunmen were planning an armored car robbery and intended to kill all 3 guards. The police took the woman very seriously. There had been a rash of violent robberies over the past 5 months involving 2 armed, masked men the police had dubbed the Balaclava Bandits. Police set up surveillance. They watched the men pile into a stolen van. They were no longer gunning for an armored car. Instead, they pulled up in front of a supermarket. One gunman stayed close to the door. The other two went inside where they wounded one man and robbed a safe.
Less than a minute later, they were back out of the business. They were carrying a couple of bags at that particular point, got back in the motor vehicle, and started to drive away. The surveillance units waited until they had an opportunity where they could approach the vehicle as to what they call a mobile takedown, and it was at that time that they were able to effect that and got the vehicle stopped and made an arrest of all three individuals.
The three men taken down were Ronald Woodcock, a career criminal with a long rap sheet; Roshan Nurizali, a deserter from the Iranian army; and Derek Thompson, a childhood friend of Woodcock's. Were these the same men who murdered Roger Pardee and Ken Thomas? At this time, suspects could refuse to give police blood samples. Woodcock and Nurizali refused, but quick-thinking investigators realized Nurizali's knee had been scraped in the takedown and seized his pants. The blood-caked jeans were rushed to the DNA lab at the center. It gave investigators the break they needed. The sample on the jeans matched the DNA of the blood in the gun case and on the armrest of the getaway car. They now knew Roshan Nurizali was the second gunman, the one who had smashed the gun case. But who had been the first, the one who had murdered Roger Pardee? Natalie Pardee and other witnesses testified that the first gunman was the shorter of the two, somewhere around 5'5". That fit both Woodcock and Thompson. Derek Thompson had an ironclad alibi for several of the London robberies. But what really helped eliminate Thompson was that he had glaucoma, which made his ability to see through a balaclava more problematic. So he cut small eye holes. In no other day robbery had any of the balaclava bandits cut eye holes. Derek Thompson was not implicated in the murders of Roger Pardee and Ken Thomas. Eventually, he would be sentenced to 10 years for armed robbery. What investigators really wanted was to get Woodcock and Nurizali on first-degree murder charges.
There's different levels of robberies that we see. There are those that will go in and just hand a note. There are those that will pretend they have a weapon. There are those that will have a imitation of a weapon or a knife. There are those who will go in with a gun. You'll have those that go in and fire a shot into a ceiling as a warning shot and then rob. And then you have people at the highest level where they come in balaclavad with the intent to shoot and kill if necessary to commit a common purpose.
It would all come down to the stolen handguns. 3 handguns had been recovered in the London takedown. Investigators needed to prove they were the exact guns that had been stolen from the Pardee's gun shop to really nail Woodcock and Nurizali.
Circumstantially, if you gave the evidence to a jury or to just anyone, circumstantially you'd come to a conclusion that they are the same guns. But it isn't as good as saying that is the gun. And the thing we were missing from these weapons were the fact of the serial numbers.
That's when investigators used the Magnaflux process. But the serial numbers on these guns had been filed off.
I'm going to use a simple horseshoe magnet. The process itself is very dependent on the position of the magnet, so that the serial number, the area where the obliteration occurs, is between the 2 poles of the magnet. Now the Magnaflux, in this case, just comes in a ready-made solution, and it's iron filings mixed with our mineral oil.
Not only did investigators hope to make the serial numbers appear, they intended to do it in court, in front of a jury.
But just from what I can see here, what appears to be a 4, and then this looks to be a D. After that we see what appears to be a 7, 0, and a 1.
The serial numbers match 2 of the guns stolen from Roger Party's handgun cabinet. When the jury gasped at the demonstration, investigators smiled. Given the cold-blooded, calculated nature of Roger Party and Ken Thomas's murders, Ronald Woodcock and Roshan Nourzali were both convicted of first-degree murder. In Canada, which has no death penalty, they were each given the maximum sentence, life.
I made a promise to the Party family, especially to one young boy who was just a young teenager. I promised him that we would get these guys for his father.
When it was all said and done, and you're outside the courtroom, and the victim's family, particularly the daughter of Mrs. Thomas, and the 2 boys of the gun shop owner, when they give you the hug and the handshake, and you know it's heartfelt thanks, I don't think it can get any better than that.
What Natalie Party and Daniil Thomas lost can never be measured. What they found is that for a few misfits who don't give a damn about human life, there are so many who do.
This broad calls up from the joint and she says she wants 2 feds whacked.
She could be extremely malevolent, intimidating, threatening. If you're trying to fake mental illness, wow, hearing voices. Everybody knows that when you're hearing voices, you have to be crazy. Okay, B, every day at noon, the devil tells me kill someone.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. She fleeced a host of banks and stiffed the finest New York stores for over $50 million. She was the consummate con artist, the queen of cons, a cross between Garbo and Grace Kelly with the moxie of a superhero. Her name was Lily Schmidt, and she had over 40 different aliases. She could morph without effort from helpless child to decrepit old crony to elegant Park Avenue socialite.
You could see Lily on a Monday and literally not recognize her on a Wednesday. She changes disguises as if she was a magician.
Lily was what is known as a paper hanger, a con artist who forges or counterfeits official documents, checks, securities, and passports. The first time Lily was arrested for forgery, she was sent to New York's notorious Rikers Island. She escaped by posting bail with a forged check. It took authorities 2 years to catch up with her. Lily ended up serving 2.5 years in the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. When she got out of prison, Lily headed for the bright lights of New York City. That's where she met and married Lenny, a felonious soulmate with a taste for luxury. What they lacked in scruples, they made up for in panache. Just when they seemed on top of the world, they were nabbed by 2 federal agents. Once again, Lily found herself in Rikers Island. Given how she had embarrassed them before with a forged check, this time she was refused bail.
Lily definitely rates in my top 5 as a very dangerous woman who, again, dangerous because she will not stop to further her criminal career.
It was while in jail that Lily raised the stakes. She engineered a plan to have the 2 federal agents who arrested her bumped off and make her escape. She was caught and charged with their attempted murder. Lily's legal defense: mental incompetence. She claimed she was out of her mind when she planned the murder. If it was true, Lily would be sent to a psychiatric hospital for 6 months instead of a federal prison for life. But was it true? Throughout her criminal career, Lily Schmidt had been assessed by a legion of psychiatrists and doctors.
You had half of the doctors saying she's got every illness known to man, and you had half of them saying she's faking.
Barbara Kerwin, a forensic psychologist, was given the task of determining Lily's sanity. Dr. Kerwin had a reputation as being somewhat of a fake buster. If Lily couldn't convince Kerwin of her mental incompetence, the queen of cons would be an old woman before she ever set foot in Tiffany's again.
When I first finally got in to see Lily, I was smart enough to bring a can of soda with me as kind of a peace offering. And in a correctional setting, chewing gum, cigarettes, soda is pretty hard to come by. I was rather surprised at her physical appearance. Because I had read a lot of the police arrest records, I had read the descriptions of witnesses who had been victims of her cons, I had seen some of the photographs, and they clearly looked as if they had come out of the pages of Vogue. She sort of looked like a wreck of her former self. You could see the bare bones of what must have been a devastatingly attractive woman, and that probably actually explains some of the power she had to get over on people. Lily was on to me much faster than I was on to her. And I could see in the beginning that she was starting to hustle me almost like a carny. Trying to find, I think, areas where she could garner sympathy, where she could make a connection with me, emotional hotspots, kind of the classic ones like, do you have any children? And then talking about the fact that she loved children, she wanted to have children, she had all these terrible miscarriages and rapes, which of course were never substantiated. She would talk about God. She would ask me if I believed in God. Did I pray? I was doing this difficult work of judging. Did I pray for infusion from the Holy Spirit? All in the service of being able to convince me, get me on her side, and make me go in there and do what she wanted me to do, which was to say, as the government's witness, this woman is worthy of sympathy and treatment. We should suspend her sentence and put her in a nice government hospital.
Lily talked continuously for 3.5 hours. She wept as she spoke of her abusive father and her terrible childhood in Bulgaria. She clenched her fists in rage as she recounted the injustices her family suffered at the hands of the communists. She recounted the joys and pains of her many love affairs and numerous marriages. But it was obvious the great love of her life had been her last husband, Lenny. When Lily and Lenny hooked up, it was a marriage of hearts, spirits, and criminal talents. Whereas each before was a small-time forger, together they aimed for the big time. Their plan was daring. Their target, one of the most secure buildings in the U.S., the Pentagon. While supposedly on tour of the Pentagon, they slipped through a cordoned-off security area and made their way to the office of Head of Security, Colonel Michael King. They filched his credit card and driver's license. Back in their penthouse, Lenny doctored the ID, made up a companion ID for Lily, and voila. Lenny became Colonel Michael King, and Lily, his wife, Mrs. Courtney King. Then, armed with this impeccable Defense Department ID, Lily and Lenny set off to bite off as much of the Big Apple as they could stuff into their hungry mouths. As Barbara Kerwin assessed Lily's mental state, she was trying to determine if she was crazy or simply crazy as a fox. It would take all of Dr. Kerwin's savvy to know when Lily was telling the truth and when she was conning.
You could almost feel like you were living the pages of a James Bond novel. I mean, she had even conned the chief of security of the Pentagon. So, you know, it became almost fantastic, and you had to anchor it.
As Colonel and Mrs. Michael King, Lily bragged that she and Lenny bagged about $100,000 a day. They targeted banks and financial institutions, opened lines of credit and bank accounts, all of which gave them access to immediate cash. One of their favorite schemes was creating forged certified checks. Somehow they decided that $70,000 was a magic amount. Then they would go into a prestigious New York store, eye some expensive item, flash their Defense Department ID as Colonel and Mrs. Michael King, and pay for the items with one of their bogus $70,000 certified checks. Their lifestyle was that of a royal couple.
If I were doing marriage counseling with them, I would have to say that this was a perfect match. It seemed to be one of the few enduring human relationships that Lily had.
Lily and Lenny never realized that their dream world was about to fall to earth when the real Michael King began getting bills from purchases he'd never made and irate letters about lines of credit he'd never opened. He notified the Department of Criminal Justice. Investigators began tracking Lily and Lenny's exploits. They realized that most of their scams took place along New York's fabled Fifth Avenue, so federal agents handed out flyers to merchants and security officers in the area with a description of the pair. It was a Friday. As Lily and Lenny got ready, they had no idea what lay in store for them. Lily had the certified check with her. Lenny had a gun. It promised to be another typical high-stakes free shopping spree, but a security guard recognized them from the flyer. He called the law. Lily and Lenny sensed trouble before they saw it. They decided to abandon their plan and get away. Lily wanted to duck into a store. Lenny urged her to stay with him. Ironically, if she'd followed her hunch, she might have eluded capture. By staying with Lenny, she ran straight into the law. Lenny got away, but was picked up a few days later. Lily was sent to Rikers Island. This is when she planned the murder of the two federal agents, which is what eventually brought her face to face with Dr. Kerwin. Here's how it all unfolded. She knew that the same two federal agents who were spearheading the government's case against her also drove her to court appearances. She also knew that she had a scheduled court date on June 24th. What if, on that day, she could get rid of them and gain her freedom? She sussed out a fellow inmate who had mob connections. After some small talk, Lily mentioned she was looking to hire some hitmen. She offered the inmate a $50,000 finder's fee. Lily's contact bit and provided a phone number.
This broad calls up from the joint and she says she wants 2 feds whacked. Me and my boys have to do the job at this point. We're assigned to do this job.
Then she sketched out her plan. She knew every detail of how she wanted the hit to go down.
She was really the mastermind. It was a pretty slick princess here. She had us times, dates, places where these cops stayed, and it made it easy for us, once we had the other stuff, which we had on ice already, to walk up on these guys and whack them right out.
When they stopped on that June 24th morning, the hitman would come at the federal agents quickly using silencers. At least that was the plan. The plan that would take Lily Schmidt from consummate con artist to consummate murderer. What Dr. Kerwin would have to determine was whether this was the plan of a crazy woman or a cold-blooded killer. June 24th rolled around, the day the two federal agents would be hit, and Lily would make her escape.
This broad, we call her Princess, she had us dress up as policemen, as cops. And we walk up to the car. Once we get the drop on the feds, we shoot them in the head, and we get in and we break her out of jail. This broad says to me, "Where's the regular guy?" And she's like, almost like shaken to death. I said, "What do you mean, where's the regular guy? I am the regular guy." She knew that the job that the two feds were whacked, that I was the guy.
During the car ride, Tony told her about the hit. How they'd come upon the federal agents as they stopped for coffee. How easy it had been to whack them.
She wanted me to run her enterprise. She needed a button guy. She needed a guy who could steal with a gun. All she could do was paper. Her and her old man did paper. So I told her, when we get done with this deal, we'll talk about other deals. We got to see the money. She didn't get no play from us until she got to the safe site, the hotel room.
Lily rejoiced over the success of her plan and bragged, "My idea was great, right? I told you those two were clowns, baby. 23 and 24-year-olds.
She wanted to know how we whacked them, how they took it. Did they die bad? I told her they died like dogs. They got it in the bubatsa. They got it right in the head. Quick. Shoot them right in the head. Make them die. She was excited, just crazy. Broad loved it. She loved it.
The hitmen waited for Lily's associate to show up with their $500,000. But the only people who showed were federal agents. They arrested Lily, Tony, and his partner. Unfortunately for Lily, the whole scene had been videotaped, and Tony and his cohort, it turned out, were federal marshals acting in an undercover capacity.
Well, there was one thing that Lily never really figured out, that I'm not Tony two times. I'm Bob Leshorn, Deputy United States Marshal in deep cover. And Lily just couldn't put it together, because it's the first time in Lily's life that she's ever been conned. The con got conned.
So instead of murdering two federal agents, Lily was arrested and charged with their attempted murder, which carried the same penalties as murder. Lily claimed that she'd been set up and that she was only kidding about killing the agents. Besides, she hadn't been in her right mind about the whole thing.
The truly mentally ill do not commit crimes with an accomplice. They don't have a collaborator like Lily had Lenny, or Lily dealt with supposed hitmen to take out the federal agents. Because the nature of severe psychotic mental illness is such that it alienates people from communicating with other people. So in that regard, Lily was making clear choices, and that's the issue of criminal responsibility.
So Lily was judged to have been in her right mind when she planned the hit on the two federal agents. But the con artist had one more con up her sleeve.
When I first saw her, we were talking about an issue in the past. Was she so mentally ill before that she shouldn't be convicted of the crime? She lost that round. She was convicted. So now we're at the next round, the last round. Is she so mentally ill that even though she's responsible for the crime, it's inhumane to put her in a prison? So now she has to become mentally ill right at this moment in time. So the mouse moved in.
Lily told one examiner that she saw a mouse walking on the walls of her cell. The mouse laughed at her and told her she was hopeless and that everyone was against her. "How pitiful you are," the mouse declared. That's when Barbara Kerwin persuaded Lily's defense attorney to administer the HSAS test, the Hidden Schizophrenia Attitude Scale.
The issue always in a forensic case is telling the fakers from the real thing. The difference about the HSAS is that there's very little wiggle room. You must choose between two alternatives, each of which is sort of bizarre sounding, may not describe your behavior, counterintuitive. The correct answer, so to speak, to either appear sane or to appear insane is not apparent even in the wording of the statement. You will start with the sentence stem, about hearing voices, and you must choose either A, this is something that has never happened to me, or B, every day at noon the devil tells me kill someone. Now, if you're normal and you have no reason to want to distort, most likely you're going to pick A, this is something that's never happened to me. If you're trying to fake mental illness, wow, hearing voices. Everybody knows that when you're hearing voices you have to be crazy. Okay, B, every day at noon the devil tells me kill someone. I have given this test to hospitalized schizophrenics, and they looked at answer B, and one of them said to me, I don't know which way to answer because the devil does tell me to kill, but not every day it's at noon. He tells me that periodically on sort of every other Sunday.
Lily obtained the highest score anyone had ever had for faking.
Lily was not having voices tell her to kill federal agents. She wasn't having a delusion that the federal agents were trying to kill her and she had to do this in self-defense. Lily had a clearly articulated plan, and the goal was to suit her purposes of getting out of jail.
In the end, the judge decided that although Lily might seem to exhibit some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, her behavior was better explained as faking symptoms in an effort to appear schizophrenic. Lily Schmidt was sentenced to 30 years in prison for attempted murder.
Lily Schmidt is an extremely dangerous career criminal because she will stop at nothing. You get up in the morning, you get dressed, you go to work, whatever your profession is, you're proud of it. Lily is proud to be a criminal. If Lily gets to a telephone, someone's in trouble. This is the con's con.
She never grew up, and in fact, that's a way to look at Lily without perhaps romanticizing her, that she was like a willful, pampered, and very precocious child playing with the world and people's lives as if she were playing in a dollhouse. She will never have security. She will never have the family that she used to fantasize about. She'll have a penitentiary, an infirmary, a series of various jails as she comes through the 30 years of her sentence. And at some point in time, and this is the real tragedy, and when it really will hit her, is she will be nearly a 70-year-old lady given a suitcase and $30 and a set of clothes and put out on the street. And all she knows is conning. And we'll see what works for a 70-year-old con artist.
It is one thing to like and admire and even relish the escapades of a con artist, but when the ante is up to murder and the individual tries to escape the consequences through a psychological loophole, fascination turns to disdain. Lily Schmidt was a consummate con artist, but in the end, she couldn't con the system. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the guilty are real. The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.